Hello everyone. I never thought I'd be saying this, but after years of being on YouTube, I am finally going to reveal my actual self to you. Today, I made my personal Instagram page where you can actually see me. The name is Joe the Insomniak. I'm going to be posting a picture of myself on there today. Also, I'm nervous as hell about doing this and don't know why. Now, I've always enjoyed helping people and wanted to say more, and I know this will be a great way to really connect with you guys and for you to actually learn who I am. I really think I can do a lot from this, and I'm really excited for this. And now with that out of the way, onto the video. And yes, believe it or not, I do actually have a face to go with this voice. Now I want to say a big thank you to the Dank Daddy himself, my friend Let's Read. He's one of the best narrators out there. He really has an amazing voice for horror narration, so make sure you go and subscribe to him after watching the video. Thanks again, buddy. And now, for the video.
When I was 19, I worked for a company that allocated labor to rural areas of Australia. Basically what you did was tell them when you were available, and they'd send you to a remote farm for a few weeks where you would do whatever they needed done. It was hard work and long hours, but good pay and good fun if you got in with a nice group of workers. When this occurred, I was working on a large property. I was told it covered roughly the same landmass as the state of Maryland, USA, about 9 hours from Sydney City, and the property itself was about 40 minutes from the nearest town. In short, it was in the middle of nowhere. I was working at the farm clearing bushland with 3 other guys my age from the city. Our boss was a guy called Jeremy who owned the farm and supervised us while helping out with the work. He was pretty laid back and was generally really good to us. This summer in particular was very hot and the work was hard. So one day when the temperature hit about 38 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, Jeremy decided to give us the afternoon off. He said he knew of a water hole on the farm about a 25-minute drive north. I was keen for a swim, but the other guys just wanted to relax for the afternoon, so him and I hopped in one of the work trucks and started heading across the property. It was mostly wide, empty expanses with a few clumps of scattered bushland. Jeremy wasn't much of a talker, so we drove more or less in silence. After about 20 minutes, however, he suddenly perked up and jabbed me in the ribs. "Do you see that over there, beneath the 2 dead trees?" I should mention here that if you're not familiar with inland areas, particularly those in Australia, they are brown or red and mostly flat and bland, meaning any bright colors stick out like a sore thumb. So you can imagine our surprise when we could see a large blue angular structure far off in the distance. We steered in its direction, and as we got closer, we realized it was a huge blue shipping container just sitting in the middle of nowhere. Jeremy was perplexed, and I asked him if he knew what it was, but he obviously didn't. He said he hadn't seen it when he drove through the same area about 5 weeks before, and he wanted to go and see what it was. Initially, we pulled to a stop about 100 meters away from it. At this stage, I had a really bad feeling. The whole thing wasn't right. It's hard to explain, but if you can imagine seeing such a foreign object in the middle of a huge barren expanse, it had to be something weird. Jeremy, however, wanted to investigate, which I understood, given it was his property, but in truth, I was really anxious. As we got closer, things got even more bizarre. There was a big diesel generator behind it thumping away, and a CCTV camera on each side, all motion activated so they buzzed from side to side, following us as we moved around. I tried to reason with Jeremy, something along the lines of, "With all this security, someone obviously doesn't want us here. Let's just go." He brushed me off, however, reminded me it was his farm, and whoever had put this here was trespassing, so he wanted to go inside. Despite all the surveillance, there was only a small padlock on the huge door. He had bolt cutters in his toolbox, and after a bit of a struggle, we broke the lock and went inside. The first thing I noticed was the rush of cold air as we got in. The place was air-conditioned, which I must admit was quite pleasant on such a hot day. We searched around for a light switch, but I could already see this was some sort of IT setup. There were flashing LEDs all around the place, and the sort of hum you hear when a hard drive is working hard. When we finally switched on the lights, we could see a sophisticated, albeit somewhat cluttered, office setup. There were hard drives the size of bar fridges and other computer equipment lining the walls, sometimes piled 2 or 3 high, and plastic storage boxes scattered around the far wall, and several desks with computer monitors arranged in the middle, complete with rolling office chairs. At this stage, I felt like I was in one of those nonsensical dreams. This made absolutely no sense. We wandered to the middle and sat down at the desk to see if the computers could give us any idea of what was going on here. My heart was racing, and I just wanted to bolt. We had been seen by CCTV, so if anyone was monitoring, they already knew we were here. Jeremy, on the other hand, was adamant we had to get to the bottom of this, so I put on a brave face and started looking through the computer. This went on for a while, but in short, neither of us had a very high grasp of technology outside of Facebook and Microsoft Word. And the best I can describe it from my lay position is that it was endless lists of computer talk. It was like how the old Napster or LimeWire download screens look like, just constantly picking up and receiving data, then recording it on several windows. I gave up on the computers and walked cautiously over to the far end of the container to the big pile of storage boxes. By then I was pretty sure no one else was there, as there was nowhere to hide really, but I was still incredibly on edge. I decided, against my better judgment, to see what was inside all these boxes. My brief sift through this box still makes me feel sick to my stomach. It didn't take me long to realize that this box was full of posters, DVDs, and photos, all of explicit and hardcore child X-rated material. One thing that still gets to me is that it was all neatly ordered into folders and small boxes. These people were organized. I immediately recoiled, jumped up and ran over to Jeremy. I could hardly string a sentence together. I said something to the effect of, "Mate, get out. Dude, child, what? Just get out of here, dude." I dragged him out, composed myself, and managed to explain what I saw. We jumped back into the truck and sped back to the house. The farm had no mobile phone reception. We hadn't bought the satellite phone, so we had to get back to the landline to call the police. Once we called them, they still had to make it all the way to the farm from the nearest police station, which was in a town about a half hour from the town closest to the farm. As I mentioned, very remote. We waited, talking frantically about what we'd seen, until the cops arrived almost an hour later. They arrived with 2 4-wheel drives, and we jumped in and led them back. This is where it gets worse. By the time we got back, the container door was open, and there was fire inside. We had only 2 small extinguishers in the cars, and they did very little. The fire department took an hour to get there, which, by that stage, most of the damage was already done. An arson report by the federal police found almost no evidence of the computer equipment described, and only traces of paper and cardboard. This means that whoever ran it knew we were there and had time to come and remove most of it and get away. There were various ways to get off the property, and the landmass was huge, and there was no real way to tail them. Since the police hadn't taken us all too seriously in the first instance, probably due to our poor explanation on the phone, aerial surveillance was also impossible by that time we had pieced it all together. I took a keen interest in following it up, but with no real evidence of who might be responsible, the investigation went cold. I've kept in contact with Jeremy, and the shipping container is still there on the farm, as it's too expensive to move. I'll never forget what I saw in those boxes.
My best friend Hannah had convinced me to join her on a weekend trip up north. She had, after searching for the longest time, found her dream car and planned on travelling 900 kilometers to the very north of Sweden to buy it. It was a second-hand 2-door Suzuki Vitara in a purplish kind of colour. I must admit that I don't share her obsession with it. Regardless, with her being the closest thing I'll ever get to a sister, I was happy to join her nonetheless. Hannah and I have always had each other, from cradle and onwards. sharing each other's love for adventure. We have travelled the world together. At the time this happened, we're both 21 and had recently returned from a trip in Asia. The man who was selling her the car had agreed to meet us at the small airport in Omar. When we arrived shortly before lunchtime, it began to snow heavily. This was the first snow of the season, no less. The parking lot was almost empty, and I saw the man standing outside the Vitara. When I saw him, I felt immediately concerned. He was dressed like a hunter. A lot of people in this area of the country live a lifestyle with hunting and fishing, so nothing strange with that. But still, there was something about him that made me feel uneasy. He was nice though, smiling and waving at us, shaking hands with us before, then walking around the car with us, pointing out all the tiny flaws. He showed us the work he done on the car, and showed us the paperwork from the recently done engine repairs. He given us the impression that he didn't want to hide anything. On the contrary, he made a show of being very forthcoming and honest. The snowing had now intensified, and we were getting cold. He opens the car door and said, "I got more paperwork at home. Let's close the deal over coffee." Against all my instincts, I climbed in after Hannah. Both of us are now trapped in the back. I had no reason to feel threatened by this man who had been nothing but pleasant to us, other than the alarm bells going off inside my head. I can't tell what the feeling was, but there must have been some sign that something wasn't right. Now the man was constantly talking. Funny, since people from the north of Scandinavia are famous for never speaking a word, unless absolutely necessary. He showed the stereo, told us about the features of the car, about the places that we drove past, about the wildlife and nature. There was not a moment of silence. After about 20 minutes, I started to notice that we're in no way moving in the direction of civilization. Instead, it seemed like we were driving further and further into the vast wilderness. It then struck me that he had us in the back of a two-door car, driving us into unknown territory, and no one knew we were there. I look at Hannah, who was happily listening to the man telling stories about the area. I then noticed that she didn't look at all worried. Maybe I was totally overreacting. We drove past a group of people standing by the side of the road, hunters planning their third day, or maybe taking a break. This truly is a very different Sweden compared to the city. The car finally stopped outside a small wooden cottage with no neighbouring homes. Apart from a small cabin that we drove past a few hundred metres down the road, it appeared to be completely abandoned. We followed the man inside. He was still talking non-stop, and continued to do so until the moment the door closes behind us. Hannah kept asking things about the car, and I could sense that her voice had a new undertone now. You could really hear that she's worrying. "I'll put the kettle on," he said, as he passes us to go into the kitchen. He let his hand touch Hannah's hair. He then smiled really weirdly. "May I use your bathroom?" I said politely, and made my way to the door with the little red heart on. I was washing my hands when I saw something in the stained bathroom mirror. There was something hidden away. I pulled out a rolled up plastic folder, and as I began to turn the pages, I felt my blood run cold. It was very explicit imagery, looking like they'd been cut out of magazines. They're glued to paper, surrounded by cut out pieces of handwritten text. When it's all put together, it made a horrifying story about how a woman was lured into a car with the promise of getting to buy the car cheaply. Then it turns to a horror story. I know this sounds silly, but when we travelled together, Hannah and I did have a code word for whenever we felt we're in a situation that we needed to get out of. We never used it, we joked about it, but now it comes in handy. I walk out to the bathroom, looked at Hannah and said, potatoes. We forgot to buy potatoes. And that's too bad, because God, do we need some. Then, the look on my face must have told her that the situation was no joke, and she said, "Oh, should we get some now? The sooner the better." Hannah, always pretty and charming, and capable of great acting, casually walked over to the man in the kitchen, taps him on the shoulder and says, "Excuse me, but I was wondering if I can go have a quick look at the cam belt." He huffed something about it's in good shape, handing the keys over. We got into the car, speeded off faster than the weather strictly speaking allowed. We then left the car at the airport and had to take the train back home.
This happened last year. School had just started and my only child was in kindergarten. She had only been in school a few days. We live in a rural area and we only have one car, so in the mornings, my daughter, her dad, and I get up to take her dad to work. Then my daughter and I come home and get ready for school. Because we live in a rural, dead-end dirt road, we have to drive about a half mile down the main road, where her bus picks her up. Everything was fine that morning. I got her on the bus and headed home. I had the day off from work. I only work part-time, so days off in the middle of the week was normal for me. Anyway, I was doing some house cleaning and putting away some laundry. I went into my daughter's room and started hanging up some clothes in her closet. I had the TV on in the living room, watching it from her room. Then I hear what sounds like a soft, muffled cough. I freeze. I have no idea what that was. I have no idea what to do. I'm just standing there, almost paralyzed. My mind is racing. Maybe the cat is outside her window hacking up a hairball. Was I going crazy? Maybe it was the TV. It must have been the TV, right? Yeah, it's probably nothing. At this point, I am standing in a room, holding a shirt and hanger, not moving a muscle. I really have no idea what to do. I then think I should head next door to have my father-in-law check it out. I say out loud, "Screw it." I drop the shirt and hanger and take off running to the house next door. Luckily, my in-laws live in the house right next door, only about a football field away, and my father-in-law is on disability, so he is almost always home. He is in his mid-60s and on oxygen tank most of the time, so I don't really know what I thought he could do to help protect me, but I was just really freaked out and didn't want to be alone, and he was a hunter, and hunters have guns. So I am running faster than I have ever ran before across our yard, and I bust into his back door screaming his name. He comes walking out of the kitchen looking annoyed that I just scared the crap out of him. I am on the verge of tears trying to tell him something is going on at my house, but I also am talking so fast he can't figure out what I am saying. So he tried to calm me down, and I tell him I think someone might be in the house. He asks if I'm sure, and I say yes. I'm begging him to come over and just check it out, and he agrees. He grabs his gun, and we get in his truck and drive over to my house. I wait in the truck with the doors locked while he goes inside. I am freaking out, looking all around me. He is in there for what seems like forever. He finally comes out and asks if I left a pack of Newports in her room right near her bed on the floor. Now, I am a smoker, but I smoke Camels, I have never bought Newports in my life. I tell him no, those aren't mine. His eyes get huge and he gets a really panicky look on his face. He tells me to stay in the truck and call the cops. He hands me his phone and I dial 911. The lady says we have to wait for the state troopers because we don't live in town. They seriously take like an hour to get out to us. I have already called my husband at work. He called his brothers to come and pick me up. He doesn't work far from home, so it only took about 20 minutes for them to show up. My father-in-law, my husband, and his brother are now walking all around in the woods that surround the houses. Nothing. There isn't anyone around besides us. After a while, the state trooper shows up and takes a look around, and he finds nothing as well. He takes the pack of cigarettes, I guess as evidence, and takes my statement along with my father-in-law's statement. He tells us there really isn't anything he can do. I can't tell him what the guy or girl looks like because I didn't see him. There is nothing. Just a sound I heard and some smokes on the floor. Nothing is missing from the house. There isn't anyone there now and it doesn't look like forced entry. Of course, there isn't going to be forced entry. We're in the middle of nowhere. Why would I bother to lock my doors when I leave to go somewhere? I feel like such an idiot, but nobody locks the doors around here. I don't even have a key for the door on my key ring. We just keep it on top of the outside fridge as a just in case. After the trooper leaves, my father-in-law gives my husband the gun to hold on to in case someone comes back. My husband and brother-in-law change all the locks and all the doors that day, and now we keep a key on our key rings and keep the doors locked at all times. We didn't take our daughter out of school that day. She was only 5 and we thought it would just stress her out. We did let the school know to be on the lookout for some weird activity, and we had talked with our daughter about stranger danger and what to do if she sees someone in the house she doesn't know. I did have her sleep in our bed for a few weeks, but she seemed like she wanted to go back to her room because she's not a baby anymore. But that's it. Life moved on, and nothing has happened since. We never heard from the trooper or anything like that. We never had another incident like that again either. I have no idea what they were planning on doing. I don't know if they were after me or my daughter, or if they just wanted to rob us. I don't think I'll ever know. I still get paranoid from time to time, and I hate to be alone in the house. My husband got me a dog to keep me company and help protect us. I hope with time the fear will get less and less. Please always lock your doors no matter how safe you think your neighborhood is. You never know who might just be passing through.
In 2011, my uncle invited me on a trip with him and my 2 cousins. We stayed a night in Vegas, then rented an RV for a trip through Utah and Arizona. Our final destination was the Grand Canyon. We spent a few days driving around to all of the tourist destinations, like Eagle Point. Our nights were spent in RV parks. On our final leg of the trip, we went to an Indian reservation. We got some awesome photos, went on a thoroughly interesting tour. On the last night, we were driving and looking for an RV park to sleep in. We didn't want to go through the main roads, and we had to get somewhere that we could actually stay that wouldn't be freezing. Unfortunately, our phones were giving us problems due to poor signal. My uncle was tired of driving, determined to pull over. We took the opportunity to stretch out and stargaze. The stars appeared beautiful in the night sky, which are incredibly rural. There were hardly any other cars or people. As a result, there was no light pollution, and the stars glowed intensely. On one side of the long, dirt road was a steep hill with boulders and shrubs. On the other side, the canyon. To our surprise, the dark was broken by high beams coming towards us. A car coming down the road. They pulled over next to us and get out. He was a Native American man. He told us he's local. His hat nearly covered his entire face. His beard grew over his mouth. We greeted him respectfully and said to him if he knew any RV parks. He said we're reasonably far from the tourist areas, that there's none here. He said to us how did we get there, and we told him that we were sort of driving around aimlessly in hopes of finding an RV park. He laughed at us and began telling us facts about this side of the park that we're on. He sounded like a tour guide. He offered to take us down an unmarked trail that only the locals went to. He said it's beautiful, serenic spots, amazing truly. We agreed to follow him. He got some hiking gear from his car and urged us to gather some of our own. We climb into our RV, gather our stuff. As soon as I put on my boots, I watch him circle our RV. Once we're ready, he leads us a quarter-mile down the road. We reached his fabled location, shined our lights upon his direction. At the edge of the cliff, there's a path. I knew this wasn't an official trail, but it didn't look like a trail whatsoever. We followed him down an incredibly steep bank with tons of loose rocks. He led us around a few turns and through tight caverns. We found ourselves on a big flat rock, and we stopped to take some pictures. He led us deeper and deeper into the canyon. "Hey, wanna go to the bottom?" he said to us. It was really dark. We're very tired, so declined. We followed him for about another 10 minutes. We see some birds eating a small animal on the way. It struck me that we are truly in an untouched wilderness. We were uncomfortably close to the edge of the cliff many times. My muscles grew tired. My uncle was uneasy and said to him to take us home. He agreed and told us that he knew of a shortcut, an easy way from where we were. He said to us, "Wait there," and disappeared. We all get a bit nervous at this point because we have no idea where we are. We wait about 10 minutes, taking more photos to pass the time. Eventually, my uncle walked off in the direction the man left from. My cousins and I were afraid to be alone, so we trailed him tensely. He came back and told us that he didn't see the man. We waited another 10 minutes before giving up. Nah, he ain't coming back. I began to wonder what could have happened to him. Did he fall? Did he get lost? Has he left us? I couldn't understand why he would have left us there. He seemed so friendly, and we were eagerly trusting him. We started to hike back to where we come from. The problem? No one knew where we were. The terrain was incredibly unsafe. We realized that we could not navigate our own way back. My uncle called out a few times. The only reply? An echo. We often found ourselves testing rocks that we hadn't come across before, and were very wobbly. My cousin was crying, holding on to her jacket. I continued on. It felt like we were lost in a labyrinth. My uncle remarked over and over that he knew this was a bad idea, but it was so late now. Since this was not a real trail, there were no markings to help us. The only source of light came from our flashlights. I tried to not look over the edge. We were so high. I didn't want to be in the back of this. I wasn't prepared for what could come. I just wanted to be back in the RV. Our anxiety was building as the moon sunk. We joked about we could survive a night in the canyon since my cousin was an Eagle Scout. However, we were merely trying to make our minds go away from the situation. Then, finally, we find ourselves back on the big, flat rock. We recognized the series of caverns we crossed through and climbed back out. It was such a relief to be back on the dirt road. We walked towards our RV, looking for the man as we stagger onwards. We come across our RV. The man's car's gone. He left us. We quickly put the pieces together. We were angry and felt incredibly stupid. As I got closer to the RV, I noticed the door was open. I remembered locking it when we left. Immediately, my eyes filled up. I wasn't sure if the adrenaline had gotten the best of me, or if I truly had a reason to be afraid. "Hold on," my uncle said as he swings the door open. My cousins and I were afraid to go inside, but we were not particularly content being outside either. My uncle took a few steps inside and said, "We've been robbed." We piled into the RV and froze. None of us wanted to venture deeper in. I began thinking of all of the stuff I had stored in there. Our clothes were all over the place. The iPad was gone. My uncle's wallet, cousin's phone, jewelry, everything. I felt so violated. We were all quiet. None of us slept. My uncle started the RV and we drove off, looking for civilization. Fortunately, we had just enough gas to make it back to the RV rental place. We phoned the police. They filed out a report, but nothing ever come of it. I hate to think of what could have happened if he was more violent or if there was more of them.
A year or two ago, my boyfriend, his cousin, and his cousin's friend decided to do a 3 to 4 day hike. We planned to do about 15 miles a day and camp out at night. We were so exhausted but not prepared for the heavy packs we would have to carry. So the first day goes okay. We're all exhausted, and my boyfriend and I realize how out of shape we are as we struggle with the heavy packs. We wake up, and my boyfriend's cousin tells us he could have sworn he saw flashlights and heard people walking around our campsite, which made us nervous because we didn't see almost anyone as we hiked the first day. This has nothing to do with the story, but still something I find creepy. The second day, we start hiking again and we slowly make our way, realizing we will not be hiking as far as we would hope, when my boyfriend starts complaining about his foot. His toe is starting to turn black, I guess from the bruising of his boots while we walk downhill. Now, what we were trying to figure out is how we were going to make it to the nearest road to try to get back to the car. After what seems like forever trying to get back to the road using a map and having to cross a river like the mountain men and women we are, finally make it to a road. Now the problem is finding the way back to the car, which is most likely miles from where we are, when a pickup truck pulls over and asks if we need help. We say yes. We need to find a car and ask them which way is the road. They offer a ride and look at all of us individually. They then say, "We'll take the girl," with straight faces. Now, I'm not the best looking girl at the best of times, and especially now I was extra gross from living in the forest for a day and a half. My group all say, no you're not. So my boyfriend and his cousin decide to go with them since there wasn't enough room for everyone. They open the truck's door and out pour empty beer cans. We do not get a good feeling about this, but they go anyway with their hatchets on their belts, just in case. So now my friend and I are sitting on the side of the road when I say, "What if they don't come back?" To which my friend says he memorized their license plate just in case. He is a smart guy, that one. Eventually they come pick us up in our car, telling us how these guys were speeding down these narrow roads and being reckless. so thank God they made it back safe. The hike was a fail, but at least we're still alive, right? I just have no idea what would have happened if only I went with them in their car.
I live and work in the very north of Scandinavia. I'm from the Sami people, and my family has always lived a traditional Sami life, until it wasn't possible anymore. Then, the family farm turned into a tourist attraction. Its biggest hit amongst the visitors was the dog sled. We take them out in the evening for a tour with the dogs. We show them the stunning view and stop somewhere for coffee and traditional food over a fire. So one afternoon, one of the guests does not show up for the ride. The others went ahead without him. It was my off day. I was surprised to see the foreign guest hanging around the property. We couldn't figure out why he had not went on the tour with the rest. He was the only one travelling, a bit shy, silent, and appeared to be very lost. I forgot the time, he said to me, looking very disappointed that he missed out on the highlight of the trip. I promised everyone at home to show them a video of this, but it's never happening. He sighed, and I felt bad for him. He was from Japan and saved money for a long time. Okay, I'll show ya, I offered. After all, he did pay a lot to get there, so why not? So it's a beautiful cold night. When we stop for coffee, we see the aurora. And at that moment, something really strange happens. This shy man gets really weird. He starts to touch me. I freak out and tell him not to. He grabbed my hand and pulled me close, trying to get on me. I thought he's psychotic, and the fact that we're in the middle of nowhere, on a lake to be exact, far from people, dawned on me. He had a crazy look in his eyes. He started to act aggressive. I tried pushing him away, but he held onto my arm and started to try and reach for my scarf. He went on about how that he'd always dreamed of coming here, finding his wife, then taking her off. When he tried to throw me to the snow, I screamed. And before he could react, Laika, my husky, had attached herself to his arm and hung on for dear life. The man started to cry and tell me that he was lonely and all he wanted to do was marry me and have lots and lots of kids. I told him that I don't want to get married to him. I said that I'm about to go back now. He can follow if he wants, or if he preferred, he could lie down in the snow and wait for the cold to kill him, and the wolves would go at him. During the ride back, I contemplated if I should call the police or not. You need to realise though that police in this area are non-existent, and something like this wouldn't even warrant them coming, so I never did. Once we got back, the man disappeared and I never saw him again.
This happened like 16 years ago. I was 12 then. I was in the summer camp of my Boy Scout troop, but with both boys and girls. As are all in Spain, scouting here is actually a quite liberal thing. One of the most important activities during the summer camp is what we called the raid, basically going out of the camp to adventurously trek for a couple of days. My friends and I planned an amazing route through a beautiful mountain range called the Pyrenees in the northeast of Spain. 3 days walking, 2 nights sleeping out of the camp. My raid group consisted of 15 boys and girls, all between the ages of 12 and 14 years old. We took food with us, knew how to read a map, how to build shelter, how to search for water, and pretty much anything necessary to survive for a couple of days, so no adults were coming with us, and that doesn't happen anymore. Our plans for the first day were to climb a mountain that was just under 10,000 feet high and sleep by a glacial lake nearly on top of it. It was a long walk from our camp, about 15 miles and quite steep, so at about 1800 we decided we were going to not reach the lake at a prudent time. We found a nice place to build a shelter, did it, and then cooked some dinner. We were in the middle of a beautiful mountain, about 6 miles from the nearest road, and let's add another 5 kilometers more to the closest village. We couldn't have been happier. We still had nearly 2 hours until sunset when we finished our meal, so we thought it was a good idea to send a smaller group to clean dishes and refill water to a spring we had seen while walking. I volunteered to go, and 3 other friends joined. We got a couple of light torches too, just in case, and headed towards the fountain. Night came while we were on our way back to the shelter. We could hear the rest of the group singing and having fun in the distance. Suddenly one of my friends stopped and pointed at something just by the side of our trail. "This wasn't here on our way down. I'm sure of it," he said. There was a light reflecting pole from the road, torn into pieces. We went from being happy and relaxed to being mildly scared in just a second, and rushed all the way to where the rest of our friends were. We told them about our creepy finding right away. We were just kids, so fear escalated quite fast. Who could be hiding in the same mountain we were at, and why? 2 of the older guys, they were 14 years old, thought it would be a good idea to go and take a look around to try to calm us down. Although being without them was even scarier, we also appreciated it. They went away with a light torch, a knife, and a whistle, so we could hear from further apart if they were in trouble. We remained seated inside the shelter, which was nothing more than a couple of tarps held by sticks near a big boulder, silent and scared. I remember hearing quite a lot of sobbing around me. I was thinking I didn't want to die there. One of the girls suggested that we could sing to try and think of something else. Some disapproved because we might not hear the whistles, but we did anyway, although not very loud. We were like that for about 10 to 20 minutes. The whistle interrupted our song. We heard it clearly. 2 whistles coming towards us at a really fast pace. I remember taking my knife from its sheath and keeping it in my hands. Luckily it was our friends. They arrived nervous and exhausted from the run. They said they stumbled upon a long standing stick with lots of blood all over it, more than what our nerves could stand. Most of us started crying. Some prayed too. They told us they were going back to look for whatever was in the mountains with us and confront him. "In case things go bad, we'll run somewhere else so we can't find you," one said. We asked them to stay, but nobody was able to move a finger to actually stop them from leaving. There was no more singing, only weeping and barely audible prayers. I just didn't want to die there. I wanted to see my family. After a while, we heard some noises, followed by the voices of our friends. They came back at a calm pace, with relief in their faces. "It was all just a misunderstanding," one explained. "It's just a park ranger. We found him and he explained to us that he was just walking around as part of his duty," said the other, "and the bloody stick was just from a rabbit he had hunted for dinner." It was quite a relief, and we relaxed. Someone even spoke about taking out our sleeping bags and going to sleep, and that sounded wonderful. But it wasn't long until one of the older guys said he was a bit suspicious. "You see, he wasn't wearing a uniform," he said, "nor a badge or anything that could identify him as a ranger," answered another. "And who walks kilometers away from the closest road, late at night, to hunt rabbits? Are there even rabbits in this altitude?" Terror came back in a second. They were right. That story didn't make any sense. "Let's go back there and freaking threaten him," one of the older guys said. We asked them to stay with us again and got the same results. Once they were gone, someone said that maybe he had followed them and now knew exactly where we were. We all shivered in panic. Nobody was paying the slightest attention to anyone else anymore. Nobody cried and nobody prayed. I remember I only had one thought in my mind. I'd rather kill than get killed in this terrible place. We waited seated, silent, and ready to fight for our lives. We all had our knives out and ready. Minutes passed, and suddenly we heard people running and approaching. We heard screams of terror. From the sound, it was obvious there were more than 2 people coming at us. I hadn't been more scared in my life. I hope I could say goodbye to my mom, my dad, and my sister. My knife was ready to stab whoever came close to me. We finally saw our 2 friends running for their lives, being followed by 2 men. They came just at the front of the opening of the shelter and stopped. The two men chasing them did the same, and we could see their faces. They were our camp leaders, who had been following us all the time, but hiding, and the four started laughing at us and asking if we were scared. It was just a joke the entire time. Everyone started crying, and some even had trouble to grasp proper breaths due to anxiety for quite a while. We were all not amused. And only after a couple minutes, the funny four realized what they had done. They had taken 13 children to the point of holding a knife and being willing to kill with it. We obviously relaxed a lot, but our fears became anger. It had been a joke way out of proportion or the most basic of common sense. They spent quite a while saying how sorry they were, but we didn't care. We wanted them to leave us alone. But on the other hand, we were still too scared to sleep on our own, so we reluctantly accepted that they all came to sleep with us. It took them months to regain our trust again. It was the worst night of my life, no doubts. I've never had nightmares about it, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Now that I'm older, I always like to think of what would have happened if two guys had been there to kill us. We were children, sure, but armed and ready to defend ourselves if need be. I'm a journalist, so I can't help but think of some headlines. 2 murderers stabbed to death in the mountains by 13 children. Things were a lot different back then, and the Scouts has definitely changed for the better.
Last year, I was with a buddy of mine, and we were going to do the Hart Creek Scramble in Alberta. But due to some health conditions, it was going to be too strenuous to complete. We figured we'd make an easy day, simply doing the easiest trail. Now, we're both climbers, and have been to the Hart Creek for rock climbing before, and had a great time, so it wasn't a surprise to see sporadic climbers on the mountainsides as we went in. Hart Creek is also pretty popular and easy for people who just want to go for a nice nature walk and maybe have a picnic. Anyway, so we walked in, enjoying the day watching the climbers on our way by. We saw a couple even doing some multi-pitch climbing, which basically means leapfrogging the entire route. We settled in for lunch after about half an hour in, leaving a few hours after so. On our way back, I remembered seeing a climbing shoe in the creek and thinking, oh, somebody's lost this. I pick it up, and my buddy got my attention to look further down the stream. Both climbers, a young man and his partner, were both lying in the creek bed, rope and harnesses still attached, dead. It was very surreal. We had seen these people climbing not 2 hours before, making their calls, having a good time. The first reaction that I had was that there's more people behind us who are on their way. We ran back, explained to them as quietly as possible what had happened, and to head up. It turned out that the husband was an off-duty RCMP, and he took the situation under control.
This happened to my father and my mother years before I or my older brother were born, but even for not being there, the story sends chills down my back. A few years after my father had graduated from CSU, my mother had graduated from TCU, and they both had jobs at a small company in Fort Worth, Texas. Having met a few company parties and hitting things off a few years later, they finally got married, and my father got a job in Colorado for a small but growing engineer company. So off they go, packing up and moving from Fort Worth, Texas to Colorado. Getting in a car with their few belongings, they start to make their way to Colorado. Now, I'm not sure why they took the road they did, but instead of a larger interstate highway, my father and mother decided to take a smaller, not-so-traveled one on a highway on their final stretch back to my father's hometown to catch Highway 14 to their new home. Having driven all day and it being the middle of the night, My father had the idea of pulling off to the side of the road to sleep for a few hours before waking up and finishing out the journey. There were no rest stops on this highway, so it was either side of the road or nowhere to rest. My mother agreed, but maybe 20 minutes after stopping and trying to get some sleep, my mother didn't feel comfortable and decided instead of sleeping here, she would drive while my father rested, and when he woke up, she would rest a while he took over. Just to reiterate, this is a not-so-traveled highway. There are no lights, and my parents are in the middle of nowhere, and the nearest city or town is miles away. Not a mile or two down the road, my mother notices something on the side of the road, and as she gets closer, notices a single man in the middle of nowhere, with no lights or anything, just walking on the side of the road in the direction of where my parents were just parked. There was no car broken down farther up the road, and there was nothing in miles to justify why this man would be walking on the side of the road. My parents don't bring it up much, but they have wondered what would have happened if they had both fallen asleep in their car that night, with a man walking on a stretch of road that can kill you from thirst. Strangers out there are strange indeed.
To give you some context, this occurred roughly 14 years ago, when I was 12 years old, living in the east side of the Australian rainforest. When I say rainforest, our home was on a 40-acre property surrounded by bush. The house itself was owned by a Swiss man called Hans. Occasionally, he would come down with his tractor and slash along grass surrounding our home so we could easily access slightly more of the property during summertime. It was also extremely handy because if you know anything about Australia, it's that we have tons of beasts that can kill you very easily. We lived about a 40-minute drive from the town centre. This meant that if we needed groceries, medical attention, or to contact our parents, it would be a 40-minute drive before anything could be done. The house sat on the side of a large mountain, roughly 3/4 of the way up. So naturally, most of the land we lived on was in valleys. There was lots of nooks and hideouts. We had trails that we could walk, and they led to a stream and a small waterfall. It was truly a beautiful place, but considerably scary to me and my siblings. We knew our neighbours on both sides of the property, but because the location of our home was very remote, our nearest neighbours were roughly a 10-minute drive away. One was a lovely old lady who used to wave to us when we got off the school bus before we made the trek to our home every day. The other was a middle-aged man and his family. He was a real jerk. He actually excavated around the bottom of our property where the borders met and continuously interrupted the stream and water flow. Lots of strange and creepy things happen when you're in the middle of nowhere, but one in particular involved a guy that I don't want to meet again. Being pretty removed from people, it was extremely rare that we ever got visitors that we didn't know come in. When people we didn't recognise showed up, it's usually because they're lost and need directions. Now on one day, a man came in the ute driving down our driveway. I remembered running inside to tell my dad that someone weird was here. He immediately walked outside to see who this was. A little background about my dad. He's literally the most hardcore person that you'll ever meet. He has one leg after it is amputated after having an accident on a motorcycle. He was in the Navy, brought up in a very strict household. He'd grown up in a very rough part of Sydney's west, so he had some shady contacts too. In short, he is someone you really wouldn't want to mess with. I wouldn't be surprised if he killed someone prior to having kids. Anyway, my dad goes out to see what all the commotion is, while my mum keeps us inside. The man has a dog in the back of his car. It snarled at my dad, but immediately cowered when the stranger told it to shut up. Our dog Millie was going ballistic. "Hi, my name's John." The way the man spoke was like he's a salesman, a really slick and smooth guy who on the outside appeared friendly with the overtone of wanting something. My dad immediately responded with, "What are you doing here, John?" The man was clearly taken back by this, not used to dealing with someone as hostile as my dad. They spoke for a while, and I could hear my dad talking with a sense of confusion about whatever this man had to say. I did, however, overhear my dad say, "What are you thinking? Just call the cops." I found out later that the lovely old lady next to us had died. Apparently, John was on the other side of the property and went to visit her and found her like that. He also said to my dad if they should move the body to make it easier for the police. This is obviously why my dad called the police immediately. Anyway, later that night, the police showed up to take a statement from my dad and John. I remember my dad pulling an officer aside and explaining that John wanted to move the body when he first arrived. The police left almost immediately without any questions, as it appeared she had died from natural causes. John was still at our home. I found him to be very unsettling, the way he smiled, the dark of his eyes. He was unfamiliar, but acting as though he was one of us. I remember it as a school night, and I was trying to watch the TV. He was playing songs on the guitar with my mum and dad at the table. I was annoyed. He's ruining my shows. I told my mum I wanted him to go and that I think he's weird. She smiled, saying go to bed. The next day, things are normal. I went to school, come home. Not seeing the old lady's familiar face on the walk back hurt me. It felt strange. I hoped that she knew her family loved her. I was a bit sad on the walk home too, until halfway down the driveway, I noticed John's ute parked out the front of the home again. As I come closer, I'm greeted by his dog. He walked outside with my dad, and I heard him call Rusty to his car when he was leaving. Apparently, he was borrowing tools from my dad. He left, waved goodbye like he was someone that I was gonna miss. Again, that sense of over-familiarity made me feel uncomfortable. I don't know this man. I really didn't like him. I was hoping he would never come down our driveway again. My dad then pulled me aside and said, "What do I think of John?" I said he's a weirdo and told my dad that I was hoping he wouldn't return. For the second night in a row, he was sitting in our home playing guitar, annoying me, and my mum and dad are visibly unimpressed by the situation. I then heard my mum and dad argue about having him around, until eventually my dad said to leave, as it's time for us to go to bed. He insisted it's early, and tried to make an excuse to let him stay. I found that odd. I was polite enough to know when somebody didn't want me around, so why didn't this man? Or if he did know why, Why is he not leaving? After ushering him out, my mum and dad have a big talk in their room, and my dad told us that he didn't like John and that he was going to ask him not to come over anymore. The next was a free Saturday, so we're going to blow up our cheap inflatable pool and go for a swim. It's around 11 AM now, and the sound of a car thundering down the driveway alerts me. I go back. I run inside to tell my dad that John's here. Just like the first time that I ever laid eyes on John, my dad goes outside with my mum and I indoors. We're watching and listening through a screen door. John again, and his weird overfamiliar smile and dark eyes, greets my dad. Look mate, I don't know what you think you're doing here. I don't want you here. You scare my kids. Don't come back. Understand? I didn't hear John's reply. From the tone of his voice, it sounded as though he's confused and tried to reason with my dad. My dad's having none of it. I told him to go away or the cops will be called. My dad then says, "Don't come back or you'll be sorry." This is where things get truly weird. As my dad lays out this subtle threat on the man, his face completely changes to one of rage. He glares at us, throws stuff, and drives quickly shouting profanities, churning up all the gravel. My dad comes back and told us that we're not going to see him again. If we do, we'll call the police on him. I was relieved. This odd man made me feel uncomfortable in my own home. Now I can't remember if it was a Sunday or Monday afterwards, but John did come back. He tried to reason with my dad and say sorry for whatever he caused to us. But he even got out of the ute and my dad said, "If you don't turn around and leave, I'm gonna smash your face in." He did just that. My dad then called the police, informing them of what happened. Apparently, they were gonna go and talk to John. I didn't hear anything else of what happened to the conversation. A few weeks went by with no sightings or happenings with John. We all felt as though things were going back to normal. This is until our mailbox had been tipped out of the ground and run over. I remembered saying to my dad what happened, but he wasn't about to give me any ideas. He later told me that he knew it was John after the way their conversation ended. The next weekend after the mailbox incident, we went into town to get groceries and fast dinner. And when we come back down the driveway, my dad then stops my mum from proceeding any further and said, "Something's not right." Next to the carport where we parked our car, there was a window that opened to the bathroom. My dad must have spotted the windows. They were missing. As we drove down, he got increasingly more tense until we all noticed that the window was missing. I remembered being confused in the back seat. I didn't really know what was going on until I saw it. A man with dark eyes, overfamiliar look coming from the window that led to the shower. My dad was exploding with rage, told my mum to rush down the driveway so he could mess him up. But the man then proceeds to escape through the window, run down the back part of our property. My dad, only being on one leg, let Millie loose so she could go ballistic. She races down to him into the darkness. She came back with nothing though. My dad went out with a flashlight but couldn't find anything either. I'm not sure if anyone slept that night. None of our possessions had been stolen or even moved. No, we must have arrived just as he is exiting our home. The police do some fingerprints with no avail. My father was furious, again alerting them to John and his behaviour. That was the last time that we ever heard from John that year. I almost completely forgotten about him. Had the summer off to enjoy myself and get ready for high school. The school I went to was pretty large considering where we were, but everybody seemed to know each other. This is including the staff. Within my first week at school, we were introduced to all the teachers and aides. I was caught completely unaware when the overfamiliar dark-eyed man from the previous year was reintroduced as a teaching aide. He wasn't called John, he was called Gregory. I was trying to make sense of it all. I was 100% sure that this man called Greg was the man who introduced himself as John. At that moment, so many things rushed into my mind. What if he killed the old lady? What if he didn't live close by? What if he wanted to move the body so he could frame my dad? If he lied about something as critical as his name, what more was he lying about? What if the police never made contact with him? I sat there for a good 10 minutes trying to piece it all together until the teacher comes to my side. That's when he notices me. The look on his face when he sees me is one that I'll never forget. He immediately recognizes me, looks shocked, says nothing, just staring. I just found out his dirty little secret. I could sense that he was now the one feeling uncomfortable and on edge. Later that day, I rushed home to tell my dad that I found him. He was shocked, repeatedly asking if I was sure. I then went into school the following day, but he had put a leave in and never returned again. That was the last I ever saw of him.
Here's my story of when I drove off the beaten path to end up being possibly the most scared I've ever been. At the time, I was 26 years old and I loved traveling around Australia, camping in my van, usually by myself. And 99% of the time, these were all amazing experiences. On this particular trip, I was heading from Mount Kosciuszko in southern New South Wales, north towards the Blue Mountains, but I wanted to break up the drive for a night by camping in a state park and maybe take a shot or two at some rabbits with my longbow. I found what I thought to be the perfect isolated state park where hunting was allowed, and since it was midweek, the weather wasn't amazing. I figured I'd have the mountains mostly to myself. I'd not taken into account the quality of the back roads to access the camping site. They were very badly maintained rock and dirt tracks that my tiny Toyota van struggled with. It took me over an hour to travel the 30 kilometers to the campsite, swearing to myself often as I rattled over yet another patch of corrugated dirt with the rear end of my van spinning out behind me. I was feeling grim and tense when I finally pulled up into the site, but I relaxed pretty quickly as the site was empty of people, and I could see rabbits hopping around about 200 meters away in a meadow. As soon as I pulled up beside a designated fire pit, I strung my bow and headed after them. The little guys had obviously already been hunted a few times before though, as they were too skittish to get close enough for a confident shot. After some tries and fails, I let the rabbits go about their rabbit lives and headed back to the van, where I started a fire, poured a glass of whiskey and lit a cigarette. Enjoying being out here in solitude and knowing that the closest population of people was over an hour's drive away. Now, I loved being by myself in the bush, but I've got this weird intuition thing that lets me know when I've landed in a safe space or not. A couple of times in the past, I've driven into a potential site, and after a while I get this pressure in my chest and stomach, and when that happens, I bail, no questions asked. After sitting around my fire for a while, I did begin to feel this pressure slightly, but after another whiskey, I decided to ignore it this time. It was far too late in the evening to tackle that road, and I was over the legal driving limit by now, after that second whiskey. Truth be told, I was probably over the limit after my first glass, so I just sat there drinking, smoking, and watching the sun go down. The sun disappeared quickly, as I was in the bowl of a small valley with looming mountains all around me, and after watching the first stars appear, I decided to call it a night. I dropped 2 pairs of shoes outside my van door. One was a small pair of sandals, and the other was my massive hiking boots. I always do this when camping alone, because I hope any creepers might think there's a man in the van, a big one, and leave me alone. I fell asleep pretty quickly. But the sound of a gunshot around midnight woke me straight up. It sounded like it was on the other side of the mountain range to my left, so I largely ignored it. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought I was, and that there were hunters out there after deer or wild pig. I fell back to sleep pretty quickly, but I didn't sleep as well as I did before. I was awakened again by a much louder gunshot, and it was about an hour later. This one had definitely been fired somewhere inside my little bowl in the bush, and it was a larger caliber rifle. The echo was huge in this confined valley. I was beginning to feel nervous. What if they were taking shots, and my van happened to be in the way if they missed their target? I peeked through my curtains and saw my fire still had a few glowing embers. I hoped that the hunters might see it and know not to shoot in my direction. That was my biggest concern at the time. I had no idea things were about to get much, much worse. For the next hour or so, I drifted in and out of sleep, snapping awake and aware of even the smallest noise. On one of these bouts of drifting in and out of consciousness, I heard a sound that had me sit straight up in bed. I hit my head on the roof of the van pretty hard by accident, but I did not even notice at that point, as I was concentrating so hard on the noise that had awoke me. Tires rolling and grinding on the rocky dirt track leading to my campsite. Now, I'm sure there could have been a few reasonable explanations for a car taking this isolated dead-end road at 3 in the morning. I even tried to think of a few, but I failed because I was so nervous, and I just sat there in my bed, straining my ears to the utmost, trying to figure out what this car was doing. Suddenly, my van was filled with a shockingly bright light as the mystery car turned into the campsite and stared down my van. I waited for the headlights to swing away, but they didn't. I couldn't see the car. My van has curtains at every window, and like crazy, I was parting them to give whoever was out there a good look into the van and at me. I was already feeling pretty spooked, but my terror rose sky high as I realized the car was now slowly driving towards me. The lights got brighter, the rumble of the diesel engine got louder, and what sounded like the world's heaviest and biggest tires rumbled and popped at the rocks underneath them. By then, I was frozen in place, too terrified to move even a muscle, as the four-wheeled beast kept slowly moving forward until it was nose to nose with my tiny van. The headlights were so blinding, even through my curtains, that I had to turn back to face the other way, with my back towards the front of my van. Then I almost wet myself. Whoever was driving that car started revving the engine over and over, harder and longer each time. It was the most aggressive sound I'd ever heard coming from a machine, and I honestly can't tell you how freaking scared I was. I didn't know it was possible to feel more terror than I was already feeling, but I found out quickly it is always possible to reach higher levels of fear, because that was when the doors opened. They had exited their car, and they were coming closer. I broke the trance of fear long enough to grab my 6-inch hunting knife from the shelf above my head. I gripped it with white knuckles as I listened to a pair of heavy footsteps start to walk slowly towards my van. The other person must have been standing just outside their car watching and waiting, as I didn't hear the second pair of footsteps. Maybe they were more stealthy and quiet, who knows. All I know is that I was straining my ears, and I was focused solely on the slow, purposeful steps of the first stranger as they stopped beside the sliding door of my van, right where I had dumped my 2 pairs of shoes. My van was locked at every entry point, but 100 what-if scenarios were running at light speed through my head. Maybe I could dive into the driver's seat of the van and belt out of there. Fat chance, with them being parked right in front of me. Even if I did manage to drive around them, I still had 30 kilometers of rough bush road to navigate. Bush tracks that their far superior car could manage with ease. I'd be run down before I'd even gone 100 meters. I could string my bow and jump out to confront them, but then I'd never been that keen on suicide. So I thought I'd give that one a miss. I didn't even have a map of the area, so running like a scared rabbit into the bush wasn't even an option. Oh, the irony. So what I did was wait, frozen in my sitting position, still white-knuckling my knife, while person 1 finally moved away from the side door of my van back to the car. Their engine revved again and again, as if trying to scare me out, and I still sat there. I sat still for what felt like hours, but was most likely just a few minutes, as I vaguely heard voices under the rumble of the engine. I couldn't make out a word, but the voices sounded masculine, and eventually, they just got in their car and slowly rolled away. I know how anticlimactic that sounds, but honestly, I don't really care a whole bunch. At the time, I was filled with so much relief, I was almost high off of it. And at the same time, I was so exhausted from the adrenaline, I felt I could sleep a week straight. I didn't sleep, though. Thoughts of them just hiding around the corner of the road waiting for me to make a break for it were running through my head, as irrational as that may have sounded. I think the most confusing thing was having absolutely no idea what they wanted. They could have just been hunters, I heard, who maybe saw my fire and thought they'd come down to say hi, do a bit of lighthearted terrorizing. Or they could have had much darker things on their mind. Maybe they were locals who wanted to play a prank to relieve their small-town boredom. Anyone wants to shed some light on it, go for it. After 20 minutes of silence, I finally managed to pry my fingers off the handle of my knife, one by one, using my left hand to do it. I put my knife beside me on the bed and sat staring glassy-eyed at the curtain on my rear window, with my knees pulled to my chest until faint light filtered through the material, turning my interior from black to smoky morning gray. I peeked out at the pre-dawn day and saw no car, no other people, just more rabbits who I now could not find the heart or motivation to hunt. I opened the sliding door and struggled outside, feeling like I was in a dream. I made a cup of the strongest coffee in the world and sipped it while staring distractedly at the footprints surrounding my van. Then I got into the driver's seat and drove an hour back to the main road. I kept expecting to see the car around each hidden bend, but really, I would have no idea if I saw it or not. I never saw anything of the vehicle or men who terrorized me, so that was that. I drove up to the Blue Mountains and met up with some Belgian friends, and ended up sticking with them for the rest of the 6-week trip. But I never forgot the feeling of being that scared, that helpless, that alone. Rarely, if ever, do I choose to camp in an empty campsite now. Now I'd rather move on to another one, filled with people.
This story happened to me over 20 years ago, back in the summer of 1992. It was the summer between my first and second year of college. I was working that summer on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. My father worked for the Park Service at the time and could pull a string or two and get my siblings and I jobs working in restaurants at the national parks around the country. That summer, I went to work for the Bright Angel Lodge on the southern rim of the Grand Canyon. First, some backstory as to what was going on in AZ at the time. From 1990 to 1991, a man named Danny Ray Horning went on a bank robbing spree across the western US that ended up with him getting arrested in AZ 1991. He was basically given a life sentence, being put in prison near Phoenix, AZ. He was also wanted in California for murder, but since he had basically got a life sentence in Arizona, they decided not to extradite him there. In 1992, Horning put on a doctor's coat that he found at the prison and basically walked out of there. He then proceeded to disappear, with the authorities having no idea where he went. The first reported sighting of him was he kidnapped a couple in Flagstaff, Arizona, as they drove to the Grand Canyon. After arriving in the canyon, Danny Ray tried to kidnap a family, and that went wrong. He ended up getting into a high-speed chase and shootout with the Park Service police, before ditching the car, fleeing for the woods. Danny had been in the military and received survival training, so he knew how to survive off of the land. At any rate, he eluded the police for the next month. He was hiding out in the surrounding forest. Some 400 state and federal agents descended on the area to get him. This made life interesting while living in the park. Helicopters were always flying over, looking for him, and agents would patrol the area with assault rifles and dogs. If you wanted to leave the park, you usually had to pass 3 police checkpoints. At one point, he was spotted in my area, near an employee dorm, so they brought police with canines to search the area. The restaurant I worked at had a massive kitchen and a long hallway, one end leading out to the back. At the back of the hallway were walk-in coolers. With my hours, I would get off work at about 2:30 AM, and at this time, there's only 2 other dishwashers and myself, as well as another man who would come in to start prepping for breakfast. The kitchen was massive. There was hardly any way to notice if somebody walked into the back hallway. The manager and cooks noticed some things went missing from the coolers at one point. They checked the surveillance video and saw somebody who appeared to be Danny sneaking in, going to a cooler and leaving. Even with all this going on, I just kept about my business. I didn't think I'd ever run in or anything. I also didn't have access to a TV or read the papers, so I didn't know what was going on really, just by word of mouth. Though the helicopters were a good reminder. In these jobs, you usually start out in the kitchen as a dishwasher, or in the restaurant. I started out working as a dishwasher. I worked the evening shift, starting at 6 PM, ending at 2:30. When I get off work at 2:30 AM, I would have to walk back to the employee housing because a public shuttle had stopped running before. The employee housing was about 2 hours away from the restaurant. I have two options on how I can get there. The first, walk along the main road through the park that took you past the visitor centre, then by the general store. It wasn't pretty. It's a dirt path basically alongside the road, but it's a bit safer and it's patrolled by the rangers. The second option that I have is to walk along the Grand Canyon Rim Trail for about a mile before connecting up with another trail that would take you through the woods, dumping you out at the visitor centre along the main road. This option was prettier, as you would walk along the edge of the Grand Canyon and the forest, but it was also somewhat scary because it's pitch black out with no light unless the moon's out. I like to walk this route because it was so beautiful, with the stars looking so bright, and also big empty black void of the canyon right next to you. Going this way also made me nervous because I heard a lot about there being mountain lions in the park. And everyone knows what kind of person I might run into on a late night stroll along the canyon. That night, I decided to walk along the rim trail as I had my trusty flashlight. I made it along the rim trail without incident, connecting the trail that cuts over to the visitor centre. The trail was a little scary as it cuts through pretty thick woods for about half a mile before arriving at a visitor centre. The trail was pitch black at this time, with only the moonlight slightly able to penetrate the trees. I walk along the trail until I'm almost at the visitor centre and remembered that behind the visitor centre is an amphitheatre, and I've never seen it before, so I wanted to go to see what it appeared to be. It's now about 3 AM, pitch black. The amphitheatre is a short walk through the woods before you arrive. I walk over to it and look around up on the stage the whole time, shining my flashlight around. It's kind of a crude amphitheatre, with basically an elevated platform surrounded by benches, with the forest surrounding the whole thing. I was shining my flashlight around the area when suddenly I hear rustling in the surrounding trees. I get a little nervous knowing that it's not wind, as there's no wind at night. It might be an animal. I hear it again, so I shine my flashlight into the forest. I step off the stage, walk in the direction that I hear it coming from, while shining my flashlight around the trees. At this point, I was past all the benches of the amphitheatre, entering the surrounding forest. I hear rustling again. It's getting louder and louder. It knew I'm getting close. Now, I grew up in the mountains of Colorado and have come across animals in the woods before. When they make noise, it's actually pretty consistent, such as when they're moving around, you hear twigs breaking or such. But not this time. I wasn't hearing anything like that. It was a controlled rustling every minute or so. I keep walking even further into the woods, shining my flashlight, when suddenly, I briefly see something shiny through the woods. I walk towards it, getting closer and closer, and I see what appears to be a large bed lying on the forest floor. I keep walking towards it, and all of a sudden, it rustles, as though something were inside it or underneath. Finally, I'm only about 5 or 6 feet away. I see it is several feet long, shiny on the outside. I keep my flashlight on it. At this point, I'm just inching towards it. I must know what it is. Suddenly, the bag rolls towards me, and a face pops out. I shine my flashlight on the face for a second. At this point, I realize that somebody's sleeping out here in the woods, wrapped up in what appears to be a thermal blanket. They must be camping out there. The face is of a man who has a reddish blonde hair and a moustache. His eyes are still shut. I think he's asleep. Behind the bag, I see a backpack. I quietly and quickly shut off my torch, not to wake him. I'm slowly backing up. I get all the way back to the trail, continue to hear the rustling. It's only occasional, but for the whole time. Then, I walk up the main trail, past a visitor centre, eventually getting back to housing without incident, but somewhat spooked the whole time, constantly checking to make sure I'm not being followed. I was somewhat spooked out for the next couple of days, but then I realised it wasn't unusual to see people sleeping in their cars, or in campers in the lots, maybe even out in the woods in a tent, because they would arrive late and didn't want to pay high hotel rates. What did strike me as weird was that when I had seen people camping before, they were usually close to their cars and would have a tent or gear. This situation seemed weird because this guy only had a backpack. Also, the nearest parking lot was at a visitor centre, and I didn't see any cars that night. At any rate, I kind of shrugged it off. I even walked by the spot the next day and didn't see anything or evidence he was there. This happened just a few days after it was made official that Danny Ray Horning had entered the park, but I hadn't seen what he looked like yet. This was long before the park became overrun with authorities searching for him. Then, one day, I happened to see a wanted picture and was shocked to see that blonde hair with a reddish moustache. The notice also said that he had last been seen with reddish blonde hair after dyeing it recently. I'm certain that the man I saw was him. Maybe he was asleep, maybe pretending to be. I'll never know. Even though he never hurt any civilians during his escape, he did kidnap several, using them as hostages, so who knows what he could have done. At any rate, he was eventually caught after he kidnapped 2 women, forcing them to drive him out of the park. They got through 2 police roadblocks after the police didn't recognize him. He then tied the woman to a tree and fled their car. The woman was able to escape and called the police, who then spotted him. There was another high-speed chase and shootout before he fled again into the woods. The next morning, a man spotted him in his backyard drinking from the hose and called the police, who started searching the area but could not find him. The next morning, A policeman went back to the home to search for him and found him asleep and arrested him. He was extradited back to California and tried for murder.
I've heard of the dogmen, even before this experience, and even if I did have a camera at the time that this took place, I'm not sure if I would have had the courage to use it. It was during a camping trip at a place here in New Mexico called Oasis State Park. Back then, my church had many children running around, and I made good friends with one of them. I was close enough with him to be invited on a camping trip with his family. It was 4 of us, his father, his little sister, him, and me. Of course, I brought everything from a Bible, I don't exactly know why, spare clothes, a small pocket knife, a lantern, my sleeping bag, and my own tent, along with the basic essentials like socks, toothbrush, and toothpaste. Everything I thought I'd need for a good 3-day camping trip. It probably doesn't bear much importance, but out of the kids, I was the oldest at the age of 12. Ryan was a few weeks younger than me, and his sister was around 8. I'm 19 now, so this was several years ago. The first day we set up our tents and proceeded to have a fantastic time. Me and Ryan finished setting up our stuff and walked down to a pond not too far from the tents. The trail to it was literally next to the campsite. I find it important now to mention that yes, there were trees, but not in the same way as a forest. These were small, feeble trees, clearly recently planted, and obviously barely surviving. I only remember them faintly, as I really didn't focus on the shrubbery, short of collecting sticks and watching out for cacti whenever me and Ryan explored the trail. Anyway, like I was saying, me and Ryan were having a blast, even if we had to drag his sister around because she was bored and couldn't explore alone. We saw a scary yet gorgeous-looking snake that was shiny and black. It was down at the pond getting a drink. Once it was done, it shot off into the brush. Other than that, only 2 other features of this park were important. The bathroom was up a slight incline along the trail, being maybe 2 or 3 campsites away from ours. That and a bunch of sand dunes built around rocky pillars, natural pillars like thin mesas, set ahead of our campsite maybe 3 campsites away. Beyond those pillars was a fenced-off, very flat and very dry area, if I remember correctly. The bathroom from the front of my tent was to the left, and the dunes directly ahead through a badly kept trail. The first day was fine, and that night we got a campfire going. We had s'mores, told scary stories to each other. Their dad told the only scary stories that night, and I'm sure the man's faith affected the gore level of the story considering we were kids. It was about some abandoned building with ghosts or something, and it wasn't actually scary. I went to bed that night, expecting a cold but peaceful sleep. At some point I woke up and had to use the bathroom. I didn't feel like walking all the way to the bathroom. Lazy me, right? So I just went ahead and urinated on a small birch tree that sat literally 4 feet away from my tent. After that, I was back asleep in my tent. I don't remember how long I was asleep before waking up to the feeling of needing to do number 2. It had just rained. I could tell from a tiny leak in the tent, and I wasn't about to go poop on a tree. Well, my little LED lantern wasn't very strong, and now my shoes were outside the tent completely wet, but I needed to go, and this wasn't going to wait, so I decided to just deal with it. Like literally every tent I've ever owned, and probably every tent out there, mine had 2 doors, not a front and back door, but a zipped shut door with a zipped shut screen door outside that. That way you could see outside your tent without leaving or having a few mosquitoes move in for the night. So of course, having heard coyote howls, I wanted to check the outside of my tent before stepping out completely, and also being a kid, I didn't realize how easily a wild, hungry coyote could rip through my flimsy nylon screen. Yet it still felt safe. So I unzip the tent door and turn on my LED lantern. For a few seconds, everything seemed clear, and the rain had already stopped. Welcome to New Mexico weather. So I decided it would be safe. I began to unzip the tent screen when I heard a very loud howl, like a coyote's, but much, much deeper. If you've ever heard coyotes, they can get pretty high-pitched, so this sound was just weird. It took a moment for my ADHD self to stop focusing on the weird pitch and realize that the howl sounded close, like from the pond close. I didn't even really think to turn off my lantern. I just went to close the tent flap. About a third of the way done zipping the actual tent flap shut, I hear crunching. Like when you're on a pebble-filled playground and somebody is casually walking. This is because the tent sites had pebble flooring, just a bunch of tiny little pebbles in a big open circle to make a smoother camp area. Not only was the howl odd, but the footsteps themselves were weird. A fair bit of time between each footstep, and it sounded like they were being dragged with each step, like claws. Well, ADHD, me, froze in my task, and thousands of ideas distracted me from closing the tent. Sure enough, I took just long enough for the creature in our sight to find the front of my tent. I instantly froze. For the first time in my life, my mind was truly, honestly blank. Sure, I don't think things through, but I never sit and think about nothing. This thing was huge from what my crappy lantern showed. It was big, and a mix of colors on its back, all ranging in random patterns of brown and black fur. It was rather bulky on top, but not like a bodybuilder. More like natural, solid muscle that might have been made from lots of running. Furthermore, it was thin in the middle and had stocky legs and arms, the legs by the hips stockier than any other part of its limbs. Aside from that, I'd note that its fur was brighter than most dogman depictions I've seen, like on the muzzle, which was whitish along the bottom. Now, I've done some research on dogmen since then, and like most depictions and descriptions of it, it had smaller ears and glowing eyes, most likely reflecting my lantern. If you want an idea to base its ears off of, they sat directly on top of it like a cat trying to hear something. At some point, it leaned down, and it sniffed the tree before turning to me and looking me in the eye for a moment. But the thing is, when it leaned down, its hind legs made some strange popping sounds, like your knuckles but much louder. I looked into those eyes, though, and I swear I've never been more afraid in my life. Have you ever looked at something, just looked it in the eyes and realized you're the prey? That primal fear that extends beyond normal fear when you realize that this thing looking back at you has all the power, that you are its prey, and it has no discernible mercy. I felt that right then, knowing that no tent wall was stopping that beast if it wanted to crush my skull in its jaws. I never went to the bathroom. I know what some people are gonna say. It was just some weirdo with coyote skin or a fake fur coat. It couldn't have been. The fur wasn't very thick, so I could see the muscles ripple as it moved. Plus the fur was flesh with its disjointed body. Stranger yet, before it moved off into the darkness, it lowered to all fours, and when it did this, its knees made more of the popping sound. The sound of bone hitting bone awkwardly in your body, or like pieces cracking off. Its knees had to disjoint and slide into a different position for it to run on all fours. This was my experience, and some might call it bull, but whatever. My friend and his family heard the howl but ignored it, thinking it would go away, so I know I didn't imagine at least that part. Other than that, the next morning, I had somehow held in my business all night and was only willing to come out when everyone else was awake. There were indeed tracks on the sand dunes that a ranger said were coyote tracks, but other than that, no sign remained, aside from the loud howl that scared any campers that were still awake. If you ask me why it didn't kill me, I'll say I'm not sure. Maybe it was the Bible, maybe it didn't care for the taste of children, maybe it knew the whole campsite would wake up if it tried something. So for all we knew, it let me live by circumstance alone. Either way, that's all I got. Since then, I've been fascinated by the dogmen. I'm giving out this story so that others can learn from my experience. I want to know more about them, and if I can help others learn by sharing this experience, then that would be great. Just don't get too close if you encounter one, because from the looks of it, they could tear you apart with ease.
So a few years ago, we went on a church trip to one of our favourite concerts that runs on New Year's Eve to celebrate the New Year. Not only is it concerts, it has all kinds of events and things to do besides music. Anyway, we decided to go super last minute, and a lot of hotels in my area are booked. We ended up staying in a rinky-dink little roadside motel about 30 minutes away from all the events, and pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The entire place was sketchy and made me feel uncomfortable, but I felt like I could deal with it. So, we were separated, boys in a room, girls in another. We get into the room. The first thing we realise is a back door. What kind of motel has a back door? The chaplain staying next door insisted that it's sealed shut, but still lets us know if anyone knocks on it, and not to hesitate to let them in, if we knew who they were. No sooner than 5 minutes later, one of the guys comes into our room. Jealous of our back door, throws it open. He proves that the door was not sealed shut. We then lock it and go on. Later that night, at around 12, we get back to our hotel, and our chaplains tell us that we have to lock the doors because there were men sitting outside drinking, very obviously drunk, as they started catcalling to our room. I didn't think much of it and slammed and locked the door. It would be completely okay to always answer without looking first because, well, why would they be knocking on our door if they didn't know us? Not okay, and I had to explain to them that you should always look to see who it is before opening the door. Later that night, I was awoken by an odd sound, almost like a tapping. I sat up, glanced around the room before I realised that somebody's knocking on our door. I very quietly get out of bed. I'm being careful to be as quiet as possible, and went to the door to check the peephole, thinking maybe the chaplains were doing some weird stuff late in the night. No sooner that I glanced out, a hand slowly covers a peephole to hide two of the men that had been drinking earlier. My heart's racing. I slowly get back into bed, trying to stay as quiet and calm while the knocking continues, only to see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. There was someone standing outside the back door as well, barely visible through the window. One of the girls I was with awoken too, confused as she looks at me. I used my phone to explain the situation in silence. We were both terrified as we watched the shadows through the windows, hoping that they're gonna go away soon. At some point, we both managed to fall asleep, but when I left the room the next morning, there was a paper on the floor. It was wrote in very untidy handwriting, very shakily, reading, "Seeing your pretty eye was enough." I can remember perfectly how the note appeared. I shredded it. I didn't want anyone to find it. I was young, stupid. I 100% should have went straight to the authorities to explain what had happened. I could have been in a very dangerous situation. I'm extremely grateful that I had awoken, rather than one of the young girls who would have opened the door without even checking. And also, grateful that I triple checked the doors to be sure they're not open.
Dead Youth's Bridge, submitted by Lauren E.T. This paranormal experience happened back in the summer of 2013 at Gifford Pinchot State Park in central Pennsylvania when I was around 10 years old, so it was about 4 years ago. The park's geography had a giant lake in the middle, surrounded by heavy woods that went into nearby properties and farms. It was a smaller park in size, with one small bridge for cars that went over the water in a little bay on Route 177. Next to it was one of the canoe launches, where families would launch their boats into the lake. Spending the summers there was quite enjoyable, since it was a true escape from people, unless you saw the occasional hiker or boater that you would only see on busy weekends. It was a foggy Monday morning around 6 a.m. when the sun was just coming up. My father was meeting a friend at the canoe launch to hand over paperwork or something like that, while me and my younger sister were playing in the ankle-high water near the bridge. Not even seconds after we stepped into the water, I got the uneasy feeling of being watched. It was truly strange as it hit me so fast. Me just being a kid, I brushed it off as my subconscious telling me to be careful. I was so wrong. After a few minutes of playing with my sister, a strange fog rolled in like a thick mist as I lost sight of her. Fear set in as I began screaming for my father, while I searched for my sister. Then everything went quiet. My screaming seemed to be absorbed by the strange fog, as nothing could be heard. I was standing there, aimlessly lost for what seemed like an eternity, until the weird fog rolled away, and I heard the soft giggle from my sister who was standing just a few feet away from me. I began nearly sobbing as I threw my arms around her as she shoved me off into the water. She asked what was wrong with me as I sat cluelessly in the water. I began speaking, well, almost screaming. "I thought you were lost in the fog." She stood there dumbfounded and asked, "What fog?" I thought I was seeing things. "I was here the whole time, waving to the boy before you." I cut her off. "What boy?" "The young boy under the bridge," she trailed off. I remember a look of horror that was spread across her face. She stood there in a daze for a few seconds before saying, "Isn't the water over there too deep, though?" Every person who lived in the area knew this lake was almost bottomless. In fact, the canoe launch was only but a shallow bit of land, and a few feet out from it, you would hit smack into a drop-off. It was basically a death trap, as so many people lost their lives over the years as their bodies were found in the water later, while some of their bodies sank to the bottom, I'm sure. I was almost certain she was just seeing things, until I saw something standing just 10 yards away. It looked like a little boy until I stepped closer. Many red flags went off. I mean, where were his parents? And how was he standing in that water? It was far too deep for any of us. This boy, oddly enough, was naked, and it appeared that his skin was loosely hanging from his abnormally pale body. The eyes, though, I remember seeing no eyes, more like two empty black holes instead. The whole face on the boy looked defected, as you could say. It didn't look like a person at all, more like a creature or horrifying spirit. Turning back to my sister, I pointed toward the boy and asked, "Is he the one?" She answered, "Yeah." I ended up dragging her out of the water while screaming for my dad to get the car, and we ended up crashing into my dad as he was finishing up talking to his friend. He took one look at us and asked in an angry tone, "What's wrong?" I began breaking down as I said it. "There's something in the water," followed by me explaining what I saw. My sister, who was younger than me, was just standing there pissed, angry that I cut her fun short. My father must have thought I was telling the truth, though, because he ended the meeting early. We climbed into his truck and we drove away. But to get home, we had to drive over that bridge. I looked intensely through the window and saw an outline of a figure in the shallow water, right near where we were standing. I knew right then and there that it was the boy, because we were the last to leave, meaning no one else was around. I learned a few years later that a few young kids drowned in the lake years before. As far as I know, there have been 3. The boy could have been any one of them. I don't see this experience as a death's wish or an angry spirit looking for revenge, but instead maybe the remnant of a tragic end and a child who still wanted to play.
At the end of May 1999, I was heading into my freshman year of high school. That summer, me and a group of 6 girls from my church went on a mission trip up the coast from Riverside, CA, to Mount St. Helens, Washington. 3 of the girls' mother acted as our drivers. We basically all piled into an old Chevy van and a station wagon. We were all heading up CPH and had the trip of a lifetime. I got baptized at a historical missions in San Luis Obispo. We spent 3 days in San Francisco, saw the capital, Portland, Oregon, Yosemite. Basically, we got to see every worthy landmark and stayed in every noteworthy town from SoCal to the Canadian border. When we stayed in the Yosemite National Park, we spent 3 nights at the Cedar Lodge. While in Yosemite and sightseeing, the old Chevy van died while we're in the middle of nowhere. Luckily, even though we're unable to get a cell signal, within an hour, somebody stopped and helped us. This was so long ago that I don't remember all the details, but basically, the owner of the van told us later that the mechanic told her that somebody tampered with the engine. She was very upset and said it was something that was done intentionally. The van had been abandoned. We had to use a rental for the rest of the way. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but turns out that Carrie Anthony Steyer, aka the Yosemite Killer, was a maintenance man from Cedar Lodge during this time. He had murdered and decapitated a park ranger by the time we were guests at the lodge. The very next month, he gained access to a room where a woman and her young daughter and her daughter's young friend were staying under the guise of checking the room for something. He basically knocked on the door in the middle of the night, and because he worked for the lodge, they opened it. He then abducted, murdered, and decapitated them. I can't say that I remembered seeing him, but we probably did, because we were there for 3 nights. It's just one of them things you look back on and think he could have easily knocked on one of our doors, as it was just a few weeks before, and if he wanted to abduct and kill us, he could have. I felt incredibly lucky that I dodged a bullet. If the time frame wasn't so close, it wouldn't scare me as much, but it continues to haunt me 16 years later.
This story took place in a state park in Tennessee on my 12th birthday. We were having my birthday party out there. That year I got a load of gifts, including something I thought was awesome. A wireless keyboard that had batteries and a wall hookup, so you could play it on the go if you wanted to. That being the case, I quickly asked my mom if I could play it, and she said yes. I headed out into the woods away to be by myself, so that the noise of the party didn't distract or overtake the music. It was beginning to get dark, but I was so excited that I thought I'd get back in no time. I found a huge, and I mean huge, tree, and I sat down next to it. I began to play some keyboard music. Before attempting to play Heartache from Undertale, since it was one of my favorite songs, I was having fun until I began to hear something. It was like a scream, but not from a person. It was one of the most horrifying things I'd ever heard in my young life. I wanted to scream back, but as the sound seemed distant, I forced myself to keep playing. But then I heard it again, and once again, before I had had enough. I picked up my keyboard, and I walked away. Halfway back to the party, I suddenly heard a weird whistle. The thing was mimicking one of the songs I'd played. I began to walk faster. You might be wondering why I didn't just book it all the way. It's because I heard that running suddenly could exacerbate the creature's anger, make it want to pounce, really. I tried my best to keep calm and walked back, listening to the thing whistle at me. It was surprisingly melodic and accurate. I saw Mom and everyone else at the site, and soon I couldn't stop myself from running. I grabbed onto her tightly, and soon we packed up and headed home. But I swear to God, when we pulled away from the state park, I saw a tall figure with long legs, a triangular head, and short, dull antlers, and I couldn't help but think that that was the thing that had heard me playing my keyboard and that was coming towards the music.
This happened towards the end of 2003, when I was working as a teenager in a crappy fast food job in the next town over. We closed at 1 AM, so by the time we'd packed everything away and cleared up, it was usually well past 2 AM. By that time, I was eager to get home. Ordinarily, it took a good 20 minutes to get to and from work. It wasn't actually that far, but all the street lights on both major streets I could take home were timed, so you'd hit every red light on the way. However, there's a shortcut, a little road that ran right next to the railroad tracks. The major cross streets had overpasses because of the tracks. The smaller ones just dead-ended without actually intersecting. The end result being, there was a stretch of road that started a couple of blocks away from my home, ending a mile from work, with only one stop in the middle. Now, being young and stupid, I was able to cut the commute massively. Now, I didn't actually like taking this road. It was in a terrible state of disrepair. The posted speed limits varied from 25 miles per hour up to 50. The fastest sections always corresponded to the worst potholes. There was a fence that ran right next to the road to keep cars from driving into big concrete drainage ditches that also ran along the tracks. The fence was, to me, claustrophobically close to the lanes in some parts, as well as full of mangled gaps where people had indeed driven through the fence to the ditch. The surroundings were unsettling as well, so I turned onto the road just before the rusted old orange processing plant, then drive past miles of rundown old homes that had the poor luck of being built next to the train tracks. So one night, it's after 2 AM, I'm driving home along this creepy road trying to get home. Just as I'm pulling up to the only stop sign along the way, in my rearview mirror, there's a car behind me with very wide, rectangular headlights. It's going way too quick considering that there's a stop coming. I look both ways. It's pitch black. Definitely no other cars coming. And I gun it. Immediately after, I felt silly. Did I really think the car was just going to rear-end me in the middle of nowhere? But then again, those headlights came up in my rearview mirror and were getting closer. I wasn't certain it was anything other than my imagination, but I was scared. So I kept as much distance ahead as I could, and when my turn came up, took it fast as I deemed safe. Glancing back, the headlights followed me through the turn. I could tell it could still be a coincidence, but realistically, it wasn't. Now at this point, I'm definitely going quicker than I ordinarily would, but not reckless. Well, not yet at least. There's one stop sign ahead, the last one before home, and it's turning yellow as I approach. And I have the universal thought, so do I try and make it, or stop? Current me would assume I was being paranoid, stop. But 18-year-old didn't want to take any chance. Stopping in a deserted intersection in the middle of the night was a no-go. I made the yellow, barely. It changed to red while I was at the intersection. I look back, and the headlights are still 30 yards behind me. I breathe a sigh of relief. That relief was short-lived, because those headlights blew right through the red light behind me. Now in my mind, there's no doubt, this person is aggressively following me. I have no idea why. I didn't know what to do. In 2003, most people had cell phones. I, however, was on minimum wage, so I didn't. So calling the police was out. Driving to the police station would have been a good idea, but I only vaguely knew where it was. So the only plan I could come up with was this. Instead of stopping in front of my home, simultaneously letting the person catch me, know where I live, turn into an alley behind my home instead. If they follow me there too, well, I didn't really think that far ahead. All I knew is that I'm in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by forests, and I need to get somewhere safe. So I whipped into the alley, slowed down, keeping my eyes peeled for those wide, rectangular headlights to round the corner. I realized that this wasn't the best idea when I got stopped behind a truck in the one-lane alley. The truck driver was closing and locking their back gate. I was in a panic, thinking of what to do when those headlights boxed me in. Do I shout to the driver to call the police? After fiddling with the lock on his gate for what seemed like an hour, but was probably less than a minute, my neighbour got back in his truck and moved down the alley more. I follow, relieved. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe they decided it wasn't worth it. The truck casually stops at the end of the alley and stayed there. As I was wondering what the hell was going on, the truck honked. In response, a car I previously hadn't seen backed up to let him out. It was a wide, rectangular headlights again. They had gone to the far end of the alley to cut me off. I freak out. The blocking car backed up into the street to my left. The truck was going straight. I was able to dart off to the right. I don't know if they tried to follow me beyond that. I didn't look back until I managed to get through the residential area, to the point that I even got lost. I then pulled up into a stranger's home, turned off my car and waited. It was about half an hour before I felt safe enough to finally go home. I never found out why they chased me. Never even knew what model the car was. I was just glad to make it back home in one piece.
Although this will be a short story, I feel it needs to be shared. To jump right in, I didn't believe in the paranormal or werewolves or Bigfoot. In fact, anything of the sort was just strange to me. My family and I go to Little River State Park every summer, located in Vermont. This was the first year I've seen anything out of the ordinary. It was 5 a.m., and I was down by the beach, sitting in the sand. I was soon terrified to see a large figure crawling out of the water. My instinct to run over took me, and I bolted back up the hill hoping that I could outrun it. To my absolute horror, the thing was almost on top of me before I got anywhere. It was about 2 feet taller than me, standing at around 9 feet tall on all fours. It was an unnatural crimson red, like an apple, with absolutely no fur. I was paralyzed with fear, and I could feel its warm, deep breaths on my face. Then, with miraculous timing, I saw a park ranger running towards me, and that's when whatever the thing was began to dart back down the hill, heading for the ocean. For the rest of the vacation, nothing strange happened, but I was left more than a little perturbed by the experience. I think I was in a state of shock for a while, and it took me years to get over what happened. But on the last day of that vacation, before we left, I glanced down the cliff near our campsite and was horrified to see the same creature standing on its hind legs, staring up at me. Take this as a warning to all you campers around the world. Never go alone at night, even if you think you're close to your campsite. This story is one of my earliest memories that I can string together of the paranormal happenings I've had in my life. I was very young, probably 6 or 7 years old, maybe even as young as 5. I've always lived in southeast Michigan and everyone here camps out. We headed 4 hours north that day. The exact area I don't remember. I was too young to care. It was my aunt's cabin, an aunt I was very close to. My mother's family comes in 2 forms, extreme Baptists and witches. It's crazy. Witchcraft is a path that runs in our family, and I talk to my witchy aunts about scary things pretty often, and they often tried to give me some understanding. Anyway, the ride there felt like an eternity, with my 4 siblings, my mother, and my aunt's family in the next car. It was nighttime when we finally got there. I remember us driving slowly up a paved road. You have to drive slow at certain times of night, because deer are everywhere. We rounded a corner, and staring at us, unmoving, is the biggest buck I've ever seen. My brothers are marveling at it, saying how tasty an 8-point buck would be, but I'm just staring. It didn't look right. I felt like crying when I looked at it. I've seen plenty of deer in my life. I felt disturbed by this one. Its eyes weren't right, and its mouth was hanging slightly open. It was odd behavior. Slowly, we drove around it, but I still couldn't stop looking. The gaze of the animal followed my eyes as we passed by, and I kept staring, afraid and accusingly, like I felt its existence was a lie. What really shook me was the fact that it looked like it was smiling. The corners of its mouth curled upwards unnaturally. I'd never seen a deer do that. I felt horrified, yet validated. As we passed by it, I could hear myself inside screaming, "Get back, stay away from us." But it was just a deer, I reminded myself. I shouldn't have felt so afraid. Altogether, the encounter only lasted about 2 minutes, but we all know how time has the tendency to slow itself and prolong your fear as long as possible. I wish that was the end of it, but the nightmare had only just started. When we arrived, we all slept in the living room, exhausted in our sleeping bags. The cabin was freaking awesome though, 2 stories, small, but the layout was super neat. I remember waking up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. I sat up amongst the other sleeping people, and in the darkness, I saw something even darker. A black mass towering outside the large windows of the cabin. It was looking down at me, watching my entire family sleeping in the living room. It was very human in shape, but I remember being confused by how long its forearms were. It was so dark from it being cloudy out, I couldn't make out much else, but it definitely was there. I was already on edge from seeing that strange buck. It wasn't until decades later that I would begin putting together the buck and this humanoid figure. But in this situation, I felt less afraid, because to me, a strange creature on the road is far scarier than a weird person standing outside. That is, until I reminded myself that only a single pane of glass was separating us. If they took one good throw of their body, it could break in and get us. As I stared back at the figure, I could feel angry and afraid, and I felt like we were all in danger. Before I even thought it through, words came out of my mouth as whispered warnings. "Get back, stay away from us." Then, when the figure didn't move, like the kid I was, I ran to the bathroom and locked myself inside. In there, I looked for a weapon, but not a real weapon, I told myself, because I could still get in trouble. Funny how a kid's mind works, even in the most horrifying situations. I ended up finding a nail file and eventually left the bathroom, creeping along the floor and pressing against the furniture. When I jumped out, ready to fight the thing if I had to, he was gone. The figure was nowhere to be found, though I still felt something, as if the shadowy man was still there, somewhere, watching. Eventually, I laid back down, never taking my eyes off the window. I was exhausted, yet afraid, but soon sleep won out. When I woke up in the morning, everyone was already awake. My older cousin gave me a bowl of cinnamon cereal. Frantically, I told him, "I saw this shadowy man outside the window last night." He hesitated, probably uncomfortable, before he smiled and said, "Did you flip him off?" I laughed and said no. He looked at me and smiled even more, telling me quietly, "Remember what Mom says? Don't tell people stuff like that. It scares them. And don't tell Kate." My sister Kate was 2 years older, though far more easily frightened. By the way, I'm the youngest in my large family. Well, the day goes by and we're playing, screaming, and running around in the woods near the cabin. 2 neighbor kids in the cabin down the road even join in. The cabins are very spaced apart. Our cabin had a shed 30 feet from it. The area was fairly open, and the adults were building a fire, as the younger ones were acting like kids, and had a contest to see who could find the best stick and had sword fights. We ran back and forth across the dirt road, playing in puddles and just acting our age. I remember seeing my aunt near the fire pit behind the cabin. She was a funny woman. She was struggling with a lighter. She couldn't get it to light. My siblings and cousins weren't around, but I could hear their yelling and laughing. I looked past her and saw my sister standing near the shed. I ran toward her, and she turned and bolted. That was strange, I thought. I picked up the pace thinking it was a game of keep away from the obnoxious little sister, one of Kate's favorites. When I rounded the corner of the shed, she was gone. There were so many trees, so I knew she must have been hiding behind one of them. I called out loudly to her, "You always call me chubby, but you're the ugly one." There was no response. Kate?" I called out. She liked to scare me sometimes. I walked around to peer around the trees. I kid you not, I only took a few steps. I looked around the shed, back toward the cabin, and the cabin was gone. I stopped and turned, keeping my feet planted. Michigan has a lot of forested areas and parks. I've gotten lost before, so I kept my feet planted so I would know the direction where I came from. I did not want to get turned around. I turned my body to face the direction I'd come from. Had I walked further than I thought, I wondered. By then I was officially shaken. There was no way I ventured that far from the cabin. I kept walking back in that direction, but there was no cabin still. I was panicking. If I was lost, I know my sister was lost too. The sun was high in the sky, and I knew I was going to be fine. I was good at getting myself out of situations like this. I had caught on to a lot of things from my other siblings, so I'd venture as far as to say that I was kind of streetwise. I ended up leaning against a large, knobby tree, the kind you see come alive in cartoons, when I suddenly heard a sound from my left. Hush. A whisper. I froze. I remember seeing a yellow haze drifting between the trees. I wasn't afraid of it, nor did I know what it was. I was simply perplexed. Before I could do anything, I blurted out, "I think I'm lost." I don't know why I said it. No one was there at the moment. I didn't even know who I was talking to, if anyone. "Hey." I heard a loud male voice. Then I saw a tall man in ripped denim jeans standing 15 feet away from me. The moment I saw him, I was terrified. I couldn't speak, and I could barely move, but I stared at him. "Hey," the voice came again. My eyes widened. I heard a voice, but the man's lips never moved. "Come here." I shook my head. I knew he wasn't someone I should be listening to. Something was wrong with him. My stomach was turning. I felt myself sweating. "Come here," he demanded. I clenched my eyes shut, and I cowered back against the tree. When I opened my eyes again, he was coming towards me, and I got a better look at him. He was lurching, with one arm tucked to his side. His cheekbones were uneven, and his skin looked worn, not like weathered, but like something underneath was wearing it. He wasn't a real person. This was something straight from my nightmares. I backed up and turned my head. But when I looked back once more, he was gone. This only intensified my fear because I knew if I could see him, I could run away from him. But if I couldn't see him, he could be anywhere. Then I started screaming, just screaming and making as much noise as I could. I picked myself up and just ran. I didn't stop screaming either. I ran for what felt like forever. But then, I ran into the neighbor. He looked at me with concern on his face, and my mom was standing behind him. I was bombarded with questions. I had been 2 miles away from the cabin. 2 miles. I was so confused. I had only taken a few steps from the shed and somehow ended up 2 miles away. I told my mother I was following Kate into the woods, and she stared back at me silently. But, she said, Kate has been across the street with the other kids. By then I was bawling. That was impossible. I'd seen my sister run behind the shed and I followed her. My aunt looked at me with concern. They tried to take her away, she said to my mom. But my mother snapped at her. Nobody's trying to take anyone away. She just wandered off. Why did you go off by yourself? She asked. I didn't answer. I shouldn't tell people things like that. About the man that apparently wasn't real. Like my brother said, things like that scare people. As an adult now, knowing what I know, I believe I encountered a skinwalker. I believe the buck, the shadow, and the thing pretending to be a man were the same thing. I remember before we left the cabin, I saw a large black dog staring at me from the tree line. It had wolf-like features and golden yellow eyes. I didn't feel afraid. I remember smiling at it from the car and waving. My way of saying to it that I survived it, that it wouldn't be getting me this time. And luckily, I never went back to that cabin again. And I am incredibly grateful for that. I tell this story not as a call for attention, but as a cautionary tale. I was 14 and in a scout troop. Our scout troop was relatively small. We were camping in an area adjacent to a large hill. It wasn't tall enough to be considered a mountain, but if you fell, you would probably break a few things. And it was super steep. This is necessary for the story. After we had pitched our tents, it was dark. It was only about 10 p.m., so we had some time to ourselves. We all decided to climb the hill together. We were scouts, so hiking was our thing. The hill was quite steep though, so we had to bring a rope and tie it to the fence. After I made sure it wouldn't come undone, we began to ascend. We walked around and found a section of fence that appeared to have been trampled over. Behind that fence, there was an old circular concrete building. We began to walk around the thing, and we soon found an entrance. There was a small box with a ladder that went up maybe about 20 feet or so. We all climbed the ladder and found a small steel door that gained us roof access, and the roof was huge. Across the roof, there was a heavy steel trap door. We opened it and found at least a 25-foot drop. There was a ladder, however, so us being the brave scouts we thought we were, we began to climb in. The area inside was cavernous and massive, with concrete braces holding the ceiling up and a light blue tarp along the walls. It was incredibly dark down there, so visibility was extremely limited. Now, some people in my scout troop thought they were funny, so the 2 people standing guard on the roof closed the trap door. And I mean we were trapped. Then, as if something inside with us could tell that we were stuck, we began to hear a certain click, click, clicking. We all thought it was ambient noises or rocks falling from somewhere, so we tried to ignore it and went on. But moments later, one of the scouts shouted, "Who is that?" He knew nobody was there. "Mike, what's going on?" someone else asked him. I felt someone breathing on my neck. Mike was now shouting. Knives drawn, we got close together. Somewhere else, we heard a laugh. Not that of someone laughing at a joke, but a distant echo of a laughing, insane person. It echoed throughout the old building. Someone turned on their flashlight, and to our surprise, we saw a man. He appeared to be homeless. His face was old and worn, his hair untidy. He was only wearing an old, ripped and stained pair of jeans, and he looked as if he had not seen the sun in decades. He was an intimidating and deranged sight. The man himself only scared us a little bit. What really scared us was the knife he was holding. Keep in mind, we saw this man suddenly and over the course of a single second. Then he began screaming. Thank the heavens that the screaming they heard concerned the two people that were on the roof who had trapped us. They knew us, so they knew that we were not capable of such an ungodly noise. They opened the trap door and shouted, "What was that?" And with that, the man ran towards us. We all wildly ran toward the ladder and climbed up, with the first guy literally jumping on. I happened to be the one in the way back. I was climbing up the 5th rung when something grabbed a hold of my foot. Panicking, I swung down at him. What I didn't realize was that I was still holding my knife. It was thankfully closed, and I ended up merely bashing him across the skull with the grip. He screamed again and let go. Thankfully, this allowed us to fully escape. I climbed up the ladder, and as I resurfaced on the roof, I saw the man bleeding. He was now climbing the rusty ladder. Just then, the door closed, trapping him in there. Not wanting to take any chances, we ran back to the small door, taking us to the room with the ladder to the exit. Again, I was the last one there, and I blocked it off. I ended up tying the bar to one of the ladder's rungs, using an old bicycle tire that was nearby. I got onto the ladder myself, and I rushed down. I met back up with my fellow scouts over by the exit. We all silently decided to never speak of this moment. We'd probably get in a lot of trouble anyway. We got over to the trampled fence, and we made our way back down. We didn't go back up that hill again. To make sure nobody else got any bright ideas, I untied the rope and I slid down the hill. The rest of the week was uneventful, but on the last night, I could have sworn I heard a distant screaming. Not that of a man in pain, but that of a man who had been driven into madness. Remember, if you do go urban exploring, bring something to defend yourself. If I hadn't had my knife in hand, I may not have been here to type this story.
I was driving to visit my sister who lives in Missouri. It's late, and I admit, I was a bit tired, but not bad enough where I should have pulled over to a hotel. I get to this stretch of road where it's just cornfields on either side of me. I have directions to drive straight and take the next left. I drive and drive and drive. No lefts, but many rights. Every now and then, there might be a left, but a small man-made sign that said road that wasn't big enough for my car. I start getting a bit confused on where I'm supposed to turn, because I've been driving straight for like 45 minutes, and still, there's no turn in sight. I pass a left turn that was big enough for my car, but was a dirt road. I figure hell, that's probably it. I take the next right, and ended up driving around a cornfield paved road maze. I ended up lost for about 2 hours before I finally found the small dirt road. I drive up it and find myself at a home. This was obviously not the right-left, so I threw it in reverse and then went to leave when I saw a light from my field of view in my mirror and movement. I look over. It's a large group of people, over 10, standing around a fire coming my way. It's like 3 AM. I was lost. I've been driving in a maze for about 2 hours. I was truly in the middle of nowhere, and who the hell were them people? I floored it out of there. I was so worried that they were going to come back for me or do something. God knows what they were doing over there. I'm thinking of it. If you're in a group of people, why would you go up to a random car on its own with one driver? All I know is, it couldn't have been good. Luckily, I eventually found a gas station, waited for the morning and ran up my sister for help, and managed to find where she lived. A girlfriend and I took a 2-week round trip last year, and backwards camped and hiked the whole time. We got to one free campsite in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, and we're the only people there, so we just take the first spot and set up. As we make dinner, a couple pulls in, drives by, and heads to the back of the campgrounds. About 20 minutes later, they come back by it and flag me down. Have you seen guys back there? Me, no. The girl said, it's a massacre. Me, what do you mean? Girl, there's bones everywhere. Mind if we take the spot next to you? Me, not at all. They stay for maybe 2 minutes, look around, get back in the car and leave. My friend said, what's all this about? I explained to my friend what the girl said at the moment. We then both look down and see a huge femur bone at our feet, possibly a cow. Well, us being a little cryptic, decided to go check out what they're talking about. We get about 100 yards back through the windy camp. There it is, full-blown animal carcasses everywhere, some scattered, some still whole. There's also one pile of what appeared to be a fox fur, another deer body still in a trash bag. Our theory is that it's where they dumped all the roadkill they scrape up off the highway, but we figured that it couldn't be this. Nonetheless, if there's that many bodies, from whatever cause, then a predatory animal knows they're here too. I don't want to be around that when they come for dinner. We decide to pack up and find another camp. Free campsite 2 of the night. We drive for about an hour or so. We're still in the middle of nowhere. Haven't seen a single car the entire time. No homes, just old country roads and pastures. Mind you, the sun is starting to set. The road turns to dirt for a bit. We cross a cattle guard and see the national park sign. Sweet, it's a national park, and it's free. It can't be too bad. My friend thinks it looks a little sketchy, but we relax and get ready for some food. So I hit a left and start up the hill to the national park. Looks like it's only 2 miles from the map. We start going up this road, go around a few curves. The bush on the side starts getting thicker and thicker, and the main road gets rough. Now, to put things into perspective, we're in the fairly new Chevy Cruze, manual transmission. That is less than a foot clearance off the ground. After about 1/4 of a mile in, we high center on a massive rock. Okay, as long as this doesn't get any worse, I think we'll manage. There's no possible way to turn around or back out anyway, so let's keep going. Of course, it gets worse. Every rock and trench we hear the car just scrape and shutter and stall. I'm clenching the wheel, holding onto the handle. All the brush on the sides of us is now dead and eerie looking. The sun is almost gone behind us. 30 terrifying minutes later, we finally make it to the top flat that is supposed to be a campsite. It's about a 10-foot square clearing in the dead brush and in front of us off a cliff. We're still freaking out about the dead animals, and now we feel like we're in the plot of some low-budget horror film, literally stuck on top of this hill. It's dark. Neither of us even want to get out the car. We decide we cannot in our right mind stay here. Even from this cliff top, we can't see a single home or car light. We make a turn, and between the brush and the shoulders and the cliff, manage to get back on the path and very slowly and carefully back our way all the way out down the hill. We in the car miraculously survived and had another 2 hours to the closest town. We ended up sleeping in a Walmart parking lot.
For the sake of the story, you can call me Cal. I worked as a police officer for the Atlantic City PD of New Jersey for 18 years. When I retired, I pulled some strings from my many years of service on the force and from cooperating with New York police officials to get a job with the Adirondack Park Rangers. I'd always loved the great outdoors, something I missed while working in Casino Central at Atlantic City. And what could be more outside the loop than 6.1 million acres of woods, rivers, lakes, and mountains? I was looking forward to it, a quiet bachelor's retirement, preserving the forest and looking after the nature I loved. But as it would turn out, nature also holds a lot of terrible secrets. I arrived at the Adirondack Park in 1995, a year after my retirement, to my designated park ranger cabin. We were required to live and work on the reserve. I was driven up from Atlantic City by the guy I was replacing, a fellow we can call Joe. Joe had worked here for over 30 years, and in spite of his graying hair, he was still spry and full of life. After a long drive, we pulled into the clearing around the cabin. Joe showed me the well from which we drew water, where the power lines were, and around the small two-man cabin. As we were sitting on the front stoop, laughing, sharing fishing stories, and chewing on some cigars, Joe suddenly got very quiet. He trained his ice-blue eyes on me and asked, "Do you believe in God, Cal?" My family is Italian and Irish. We're about as Catholic as you could get. My answer was an instant yes. Joe grimaced, grinding the stogie on the wooden railing of the porch. "I don't know about God myself," Joe said, staring at the old growth rows of oak that ringed the clearing. "The devil I'm more sure of, because I've seen him. He lives in those woods." I thought Joe was being overdramatic, and I chuckled. But he gave me a look, a cold, dark, and foreboding look, and my laughter extinguished. "You'll see what I mean soon enough," he said, disposing of his cigar in the garbage inside the cabin. As he came back out with his fedora, he paused and looked at me. "I love these woods, but there are dark things out there you couldn't even begin to imagine." For the first month after Joe left, I could almost convince myself his terrifying words were nothing more than park ranger hazing. He was initiating me to the camp by scaring me. Yeah, that was it. I quickly fell into the rhythm of ranger life, patrolling the woods and clearing paths, participating in biomass surveys with people from Albany. It wasn't all sunshine, though. Poachers were rife, and the anti-government militias training illegally in the park aren't friendly at the best of times. But after 18 years on the beat, those punks didn't scare me. What did scare me, to the point of quitting this job, happened late one night. Part of my old life on the beat was being a night owl, and being a park ranger was no exception. It was late one August and almost 10 p.m. when the ranger station called in. They said a family had been separated from their little girl, and they needed all hands on deck to mount a search. I was instantly awake, putting down my dog-eared W.E.B. Griffin book, and hauling on my park ranger uniform and donning my cap. I met up with my boss, Captain O'Rourke, and he assigned me to follow a tributary of Grindstone Creek, near where the family had last seen their daughter. I led a bunch of civilian volunteers down the creek, armed with flashlights and intermittent firearms. There had been black bear activity in the area, so packing heat made sense. As we fanned out along the creek, I gradually separated from the others, scanning the forest until my flashlight caught something pink, totally at odds with the summer ground cover. I yelled out that I'd found something, but then my flashlight panned up, and I wish to this day that I'd never done that. I'd found the girl, but she was in pieces, scattered across the clearing. What my flashlight had caught was her arm, no longer attached, with the stub of a pink t-shirt still there. I had seen horrible gangland violence, but nothing ever topped the brutality of this scene. I gagged, and that was when I heard it. It was a strange cooing, hooting sound. Something about the sound turned the blood in my veins to ice as I panned my light in the direction of it, and it felt like my soul died in my chest. Standing there, easily 7 feet tall, was this thing. That's the only way I can describe it. It was tall but heavily emaciated, about as wide as a lamp pole. I could see its ribs protruding out of its rotting gray flesh. Its feet were hooved, but it had hands like a man, albeit with long, disgusting black talons in place of fingers. Its head, that was what still gives me nightmares. Instead of a normal head, it appeared more as a buck's skull with a massive rack of 8 or so points. Its mouth was full of dagger-like teeth, which curved up and outwards the closer to the front of the mouth they got. In its jaws, I saw a piece of the child, dangling limply as it fixed me with a nightmarish gaze from demonic yellow eyes. I didn't move, nor did the thing, for a space of about 10 seconds, when it cocked its head to the side. It let out another coo hoot and took a step towards me. I screamed, and as fast as I possibly could, made for my revolver, but in the blink of an eye, it was gone, disappearing in the brush. The remainder of the search party found me pretty quickly, considering I had apparently and unknowingly fired my entire revolver cartridge into the now empty woods, and I'd been crying. When I explained what had happened, I lied, mostly to myself, saying that I saw a black bear, but that's definitely not what I remember. Whatever it wasn't natural, not of this world of the living. There and then that day, I quit my job. I left the Adirondacks, and I have never looked back. I pray that what I saw was simply some sort of vision or hallucination, but it was very, very real to that little girl.
I was driving back to school one fall. It's about a 12-hour drive, and I was doing it all in one go. There's a lot of middle of nowhere, and teeny tiny towns on my drive. I really had to pee, and there hadn't been anything for quite a while. Finally, there's one of those freeway signs with food, gas, and lodging listed for the next exit. I've been driving for about 9 hours now. The sign said there was a gas station, as well as a fast food restaurant. Those have bathrooms, so I take the exit. Usually, those signs mean there is something right off the freeway, but I end up following the signs for several miles and finally see the fast food restaurant. It's just starting to get dark. As I pull into the parking lot, this little cat runs in front of my car, but I'm going slowly enough not to hit it. The parking lot's empty, and there isn't much around. Mostly trees. I get out of the car and see another cat, then another. I mean, there's literally about 30 plus cats that I can see, so probably a lot more that I don't. There are 3 colorings, all black, grey, orange. They vary in size but look basically identical. They all stare at me. I took a step forward. They all step back, almost simultaneously. I step back and they all move closer. I walk to the restaurant, get a drink, use a bathroom. I said to the person at the till, "Lot of cats here." She said, "Yeah." And that was it. This place is too weird for me, so I got back in the car and they're all still there staring at me. This time, I see giant bowls of food up in the trees. Someone's coming and looking after the colony. Just as I'm thinking this, I see a dark figure in the tree line. Nope, I've had enough. I got back in my car and went straight to the freeway. So for those wondering, this is my story. My father, my brother, and I were crab fishing deep in the jungles of Puerto Rico. A new place we had never gone in an effort to find some lucky finds of crabs. We had to go through an initial barbed wire boundary to really get to where the crabs were. After so, we split up to cover as much ground as possible. We spent so much time there that the sun had set and the forest was so impossibly dark. If no lights were on, you wouldn't be able to see more than a few feet in front of you in any direction. All alone, I trekked deeper in, phone in my hand. I'm looking down for movements or any possible signs of crabs rustling about in the bushes. I come across an old cement foundation which, after looking over, was just an abandoned house project which never got past a cement floor or proportion of a wall. Off into the distance though, I found a complete cement structure with overgrown vines and completely isolated from anything human related. Now obviously, with my knowledge of terrible horror movies, I knew I should be very careful while peering my head into one of the 3 compartments it had. In hindsight, horror movie knowledge should be just a bolt out of there. From what I could tell, it was supposed to be a lavatory, but was never completed. Weird thing was that in the first room, there was a square toilet-like structure with a really weird smell, cockroaches everywhere, which made me legitimately frightened that some might fall on me. The room in the middle was just square and empty, though the third had the layout of the square room with a shower. What was really odd about the whole thing, aside from what I'd already seen, was that in the square toilet of the first room, I peered in with my flashlight, There was an entire room underneath the cement structure, about a 12-foot drop underneath the cement square. There was some trash thrown down there, but the smell was stronger closer to the hole. I tried to see as much as I could, but there was only a dirt floor 12 feet underneath the actual floor. Weirdest part about this? I looked around the entire structure. There was no way through to the chamber, except through the square hole, about 2 feet wide. I then heard rustling everywhere nearby. I checked if it was a crab. It wasn't. I then got out of there.
Haunted Forest, submitted by Matthew 2829. I lived in the Philippines. It's a beautiful country, but in my case I lived in the northern part of the Philippines, known as the Mountain Province, and though it was quite serene out there, as a child, I always felt like something was wrong in the forests near my house. The year was 1979, and there weren't many houses in our rural town. Only my relatives lived there, really, during the time. Back then, I was 9 years old, and I loved playing around with my cousin Brandon, who was 19, and worked part-time as a voluntary forest ranger. We often went to the forest near my house to play. In spite of our age differences, we still enjoyed hiking outdoors. At one point, we were next to a steep cliff, and I slipped, nearly falling off. Brandon caught me and helped me regain my balance. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the fact that the cliff even existed. We had been all throughout these forests before, and never once have we seen or stumbled upon this cliff. What I mean is, yesterday this cliff hadn't been there. We weren't even half a mile from the house. I tried to explain it to myself, and I just chalked it up to a landslide or something. As I dusted myself off and we began to walk again, we began to hear movements around us. "Who's there?" my cousin asked, and I felt chills coming out of my spine and my hair standing on end. "Anino, or shadow," my cousin whispered. "Do you see it?" I didn't reply. There are many of them," I said, finally, seeing it for myself. We turned back and ran as fast as we could. I remember shouting so loud, my mom came out rushing towards me. She saw me and got angry and said, "Why do you go out there alone like that? It's dangerous." I froze right then and there. "What do you mean? Brandon's right here with me." She got down on her knees and scraped some dirt off of my face. "Look, you got hurt." "Mom, stop," I said. "What did you mean? Brandon was just right here." I looked around me, and I noticed that Brandon wasn't there anymore. When I turned back to my mother, she had a very concerned and sad look on her face. With hesitation in her voice, she had to remind me, "Honey, remember, Brandon passed away just yesterday." I was in complete shock. Turns out, way back then, I did that quite a lot. Because when Brandon was gone, it hurt me bad. It took me years to get over it. But that day I remember vividly seeing him, seeing the shadows, nearly falling down a cliff. Was it all just a dream? Again, Brandon was a voluntary forest ranger in his time, and he had helped a lot of people in the woods. And before he passed, he had taken care of me a lot. Every time he had gone to our house, he would tell me stories about his adventures in the woods, about the shadows he'd see, the whispers he heard, and even the time he saw the tikbalong, a half-horse, half-human creature. I always thought those stories were only just stories. Anyway, that was what inspired me when I was 18, to serve as a voluntary ranger myself. I'm beginning to understand how it was for him. The nighttime whispering you could hear all around the woods. the strange movements you'd see out of the corner of your eyes. We used to have to work with partners. My partner, Andy, heard them too, the whispering. He was also very afraid to go out after dark and would try to get out of his duties at nighttime as much as possible. On one occasion when Andy and I talked about our girlfriends, just hanging out at the ranger station on a quiet night, we suddenly heard a terrible scream. Now, we would have gotten up and ran to the rescue as fast as possible. The thing is, it didn't sound like a man or a woman. It sounded like something else. Just the sound of it hurt our ears, as if whatever it was standing right next to us. When it stopped, Andy asked me, "What in the world was that?" I didn't reply right away, because I didn't know myself. Instead, after a few moments, I recommended that we shut and lock all the doors and windows. I still live here with my lovely wife, who's half Japanese, and our daughter, as well as a 1-month-old baby boy. And despite being very creeped out by the forests around us, I'm more determined than ever to protect my family and our neighbors from the things in the woods.
I used to run bread for a big red company and started at 3 AM. I had to drive to a few remote stores in little towns surrounding my own town. I was about halfway through the 50-mile drive to the next town. It was dark out. There were no houses around for a long way in any direction. I look on the side of the road ahead of me and see a backhoe, which was odd itself. Then, I notice his bucket is super high. As I get closer, I realize he's gutting a cow that's hanging from a bucket. Now, I grew up around ranching, so I wasn't freaked out. For some reason, I decided to slow down and help the guy. I can't explain the decision. When I stop next to him, he smiles and waves. So do I, and say, "Need a hand?" He cracks up, laughing just hysterically, slapping his knees. For some reason, I start to laugh. Now we're two guys cracking up, one covered in blood, the other with a truck full of bread. The reality of the situation makes its way into my sleep-deprived brain. I hit the gas and get out of there. I thought about it and realized that this guy drove a tractor in the middle of nowhere to kill someone else's cow. The other thing, it's 3 AM in the morning. Who knows how far away he has to drive this thing? No idea what the hell happened. I'm glad I escaped when I did. I went on a midnight walk with my girlfriend. The park by our home had a dirt trail that led up a small mountain. It was about a 30-minute walk to the top, but the view overlooking the city was amazing. At the top, the dirt path became paved concrete with a small sitting area. We stayed at the top for about half an hour. Upon leaving, things got creepy. As we began to head back down, at the point where the concrete met the dirt path, there are trash bags in a crescent shape in the corner of the path's intersection. It was not there when we first arrived. The pile was much too large and in the way for someone who likes to cut corners of the path not to notice. My girlfriend realized that it looked like a dead body and said to me if I noticed it on the way up. I was very sure that it was not there 30 minutes prior when we arrived. I was extremely sure. Nonetheless, there was no reason to freak my anxiety-prone girlfriend out, So I laughed and said that, yeah, it's probably just trash. Visibility is low, probably about 5 yards. I didn't want to freak her out, but I was pretty tilted. I got heckled for being drunk and not listening to her, but in actuality, I was looking and listening for any signs of people around us. In my head, I was telling myself I was being paranoid, that it probably wasn't anything to worry about. I'm sorry I didn't have time to listen to your story about Jessie from work, but I was worried about our safety. We made it back to our car without running into another body. I kind of laughed at myself for being so worried, and felt also relaxation when we finally got back, not being in such a tense situation. A few days later, the local news covered a dead body found near a park in Anthem, at the top of the mountains. So it was actually a dead body. Literally typing this is making me shake.
In the early 2000s, when I had just graduated high school, I was looking for any and every way to get into the Forest Service. I wanted to work my way up to being a game warden, but that dream quickly subsided. Because when I was taken in as a park ranger around Devil's Den in Arkansas, I was smitten. The job never felt like a job, and it was very satisfying. Rarely did we have emergency calls, but when we did, finding that lost person or helping the injured get help, it left you with a feeling like you could actually have an impact on the world. All while preserving nature, of course. There was one emergency call, though, that was a game changer for me. I don't think I've ever been the same because of it. The year was 2005. It was early December and quite a cold year for Arkansas. We received a call that night that a child had gone missing. My first thought was who would go hiking during this weather, and why on earth would they bring their child? But wait, it gets better. It wasn't even a kid, it was a baby, a little over a year old in fact, and they hadn't been hiking. The couple lived just a ways from the park. They called in stating that their baby was gone after hearing sounds around their house. The window to the baby's room had been opened, and they heard footsteps heading in the direction of the park. Red flags were going up everywhere while I listened in on the details of the situation. Nonetheless, I grabbed my gear, and I set off to search my side of these forests and hills. 3 long, drawn-out hours later, and I was exhausted. I hadn't rested, drank much water, or eaten since I was back at the headquarters. The excitement and rush of quickly going to the rescue was fading, and I was ready to just sit down for a few moments. But that's when I heard the crying. Immediately, I ran toward it, straight uphill. The trees began to thin, and soon the tree line broke completely, as I stumbled upon a clearing with a large flat-top rock in it. It was just one of many random boulders in the forests. I began to work my way past it when I heard the crying again. It was louder, and now I knew that it was coming from on top of the rock. Now, the boulder was easily 15 feet high, so despite my confusion, I grabbed onto any protrusion or opening I could find, and I climbed. It took me about 90 seconds to ascend the rock. Winded, I pulled myself up onto the flat top, and I saw the baby. He was wrapped and swaddled in light blue, crying. But oddly enough, there wasn't a scratch or speck of dirt on him, or the cloth for that matter. How in the world did he get up here in such a state? I was a fully grown man, and it took every ounce of energy I had to climb the rock, and there was no way I could do this while holding a baby. If multiple people had taken him and laid him up here, then the better question is, why? Who on this planet takes a baby in the night, runs a few hours into the woods, lays the baby on a rock while making sure he's perfectly clean, then leaves without a trace. I was astonished and a bit creeped out, but I called for backup, as I couldn't get the child off the rock by myself. When the parents got their child, they were greatly relieved, but then they were quickly weirded out because they said that they hadn't swaddled the baby when they put him to bed, and that they didn't even own the blanket we found him in. This was easily the weirdest experience I had as a forest ranger, and the weirdest experience in my life, period.
I lived in a national park by myself for 3 months. Several times when I was going back to my trailer for the day, I would hear music, like a music box or an ice cream truck. It was always loud, and it sounded as though it was coming from my head. One day, I decided to look for the source, so I followed the dirt road past my trailer. The music continued. I couldn't tell if I was getting closer or not. I had my eyes on the trees and looked down just in time to avoid stepping on a snake. I scrambled back. It didn't move. I now realize it is dead, and it's not alone. There were 6 dead copperheads stretched out in the road, looking in the same direction. I went back to my car because I couldn't bring myself to step over them, even if they were dead. By the time I got my keys, the music had stopped, and I didn't hear it again. I was driving across country alone on the 10. I was in the middle of the desert. My car said I only had about 20 miles left in gas, so I pulled off to the first place that I'd seen for the last hour. Since I was young, sick, and a woman, I made the rule that every time I stopped for gas, I would only pay at the pump, and would never leave my car to go inside or anywhere else aside from the hotels I stayed at. So I swipe my card, and it's processing the transaction. It suddenly cancels, prompts me to go to the cashier. I try again. Halfway through trying it in my zip code, it cancels and tells me again to see the cashier. I look towards the convenience store. I see it has broken windows. It is boarded up and completely abandoned. Even the tool station sign is torn apart. I spot someone inside peering at me from between the boards. The second I see them, I jump away. They clearly didn't want to be seen, but kept trying to get me to come into the abandoned station by cancelling my transaction. Nope. I got back in my car, and by some miracle made it to the next station 30 miles away.
Number 1. What we encountered in those woods. Submitted by Chris B. I lived in Tennessee, and I was a big fan of camping and hiking. In 2006, me, my girlfriend, and my cousin, with 4 other friends, had gone out on a hiking trip. My girlfriend's uncle had a rather large property he sometimes allowed people to stay at. In one remote corner of this land, he even had an old cabin that he would rent out occasionally, and this property was connected to a no man's land, as some people called it. You could go out there, as some of us had before, but you wouldn't see any other signs of people at all. We intended to rough it along the back trails with the intention to camp overnight. After a long hike, it got dark, so we built a fire and set up our small tents. Then we had a couple of beers, cooked a few hot dogs over the flames. It was pleasantly uneventful until near midnight. We had been telling stories when suddenly my cousin started looking off into the dark and began to try to hush us. Shh, guys. After a few moments of quiet, I tried to ask what was happening when he bluntly told me to hush up. I heard something like voices out there, I think. We all stayed quiet for the next minute or two. My cousin swearing he had heard voices calling out there past the tree line in the distance. Soon we began catching what sounded like the faintest yelling that we couldn't quite make out, and a few of us began yelling back to whoever it was out there in the dark, trying to get a response of any kind. We thought that maybe someone was lost. In these woods, it wouldn't be hard. "Hello? Is someone out there? Are you okay?" My girlfriend yelled, joined in by one of my friends, shouting through his cupped hands. "Hello!" All we heard in reply was what sounded like muffled voices, 2 voices, as if they were calling from a great distance. But it sounded like there was somebody moving around just on the far side of the nearby tree line, and they couldn't have been greater than 100 yards away. More echoing shouts came from that area, but they were still indiscernible. It sounded like 2 people shouting at the same time. Increasingly, I became nervous, wondering who was moving around out there, imagining backwoods creeps playing games with their victims. Here at midnight, something was wrong, I felt. For a short while, we heard nothing. One of my friends went to his gear and retrieved the old Ruger Bearcat 22 that his father gave him as a gift. "If someone wants to rush our camp, I'd like for us to be ready," he said. I nodded, feeling on edge. "Do you need help?" my cousin shouted again. In response came 2 voices shouting vaguely once more, still sounding distant. Before, they had sounded like someone shouting words, even if we couldn't quite make it out. But now the shouts were loud and garbled, wordless shouts and baying noises. Someone was moving around out there. My girlfriend said what I was thinking quietly. Who are these people? Why are they here, and why are they messing around somebody's camp right now? For the next half hour, there was silence besides the fire and the nightlife. We sat on guard around the fire, straining to listen. During that stretch, we heard no more shouting or footfalls. We resolved to keep the 22 around, just in case someone came barging into our camp. Several minutes later, we heard what sounded like people moving about only a short distance past the light cast by our fire. Footfalls and the crackle of branches and leaves. It sounded like someone was staggering around at a brisk speed, just out of our campsite. A couple of us expected someone to step into the light at any moment, but no one did. Suddenly, it stopped. Not another voice was heard, no footfalls, no crunching of grass or branches, nothing to indicate that the people or things that were by our camp were still there, or had even gone away for that matter. It was more like they had just started standing still. All of us were extremely nervous, especially with how the sounds of footsteps had just stopped instead of moving away. We were sure somebody was just watching us from a ways off and waiting for us to fall asleep. We managed to organize ourselves to sleep in shifts, at least 2 people to stay awake at all times while the others slept in our tents. It wasn't easy, especially with an odd-numbered group, but the rest of the night passed without incident, thankfully. In the morning, we nervously gathered our gear and decided to leave, the appeal of being out in the woods having vanished in the night. What disturbed me was how far off the voices had sounded, yet how closely the movements had come to us, and how they had disappeared so suddenly. I was certain that this was not just some people deciding to prank campers, or any sneaking backwoodsman having a good laugh. This was something else entirely.
When I was in about the 6th grade, a friend and I went to another girl's house, which was in the country, a few days before Halloween. We wanted spooky things to happen, so we did the typical preteen girl creepy slumber party activities, like playing with the Ouija board, doing Bloody Mary. The next evening, the girl who lived there told us that she heard of a crazy lady who lived nearby and threw stuff at people. We decided to take her golf cart and try and find her, then videotape her throwing stuff at us. We didn't. We got lost in the woods instead. All of a sudden, I saw something, or someone, floating in the distance. My friend turned on the camera and got out of the golf cart to get a closer look. We were scared, but curious now. "It's a person," I remembered saying. "Oh, he's dead. No, it's a Halloween decoration." My friend insisted. It was not a Halloween decoration. It's a dead body hanging from a tree. At first we thought he was murdered, then put up on display. The concept of suicide was not well formed in our heads, but the knocked over ladder and the tape confirmed this. My friend called the cops. When they arrived, we were told immediately to leave. I remembered a ton of police cars and an ambulance. They made us turn off the camera, which had been rolling the whole time, and call their mum to get us back to the home. The parents tried to convince us as we sat in the kitchen crying it wasn't real, but the police don't send kids home if it's not a dead body. Every year before Halloween, I have nightmares about this event. I'm on a hill in the dark. There are dead trees surrounding me with a dead body on each one. A few years ago, a friend and I went to explore a nearby limestone cave. I had been there before, but never went very deep. I had read of a waterfall which eventually led to an expansive area beyond, so we set out to try and find the path. Now, since we've never been on this route, we took turns going forward and checking back to avoid passing points of no return, without one of us being above with a rope to toss down. After the familiar routes behind us, we found a tight climb down. The squeeze was like going from the front seat to the back seat in a compact sedan. That's vertical. No problem. We find a tunnel, wide yet short. We took our packs and dragged them behind our feet while we crawled maybe 10 to 15 meters down. I was getting a little claustrophobic, but we knew what we were getting into. We came to a small opening about the size of a bathroom, the space we could stand in, so we had a bit of relief. The path forward was a small square tunnel, the same height as the previous one, but about 2 meters wide. We jokingly called it the coffin crawl. This route required us to go one behind the other and led to a 90-degree turn. At the turn, I could see the path continued past the range of my headlamp, but mostly all seemed level and safe. At this point, it became apparent that the path was getting more and more narrow, ever so slightly. If we want to turn back, we would have to crawl back single file. I could not speculate how far we crawled, but it seemed like a very long way, until I could see a small opening ahead, maybe the size of a cramped coat closet, but 2/3 the height. At this point, that space was looking pretty comforting, because it would mean we could at least turn around if we decide to go back. Right before the coming closet-sized space was the tightest space I'd ever crawled into in a cave. I mean, I literally had to place one arm ahead and drag the other one to get my shoulders to fit diagonally. As my light illuminated the closet space, I could see a single stalagmite in the center and some bats resting on its walls. It had walls that were sloped into the ceiling. Small mouse-eared bats. They sound really funny. Were infrequent, but not a shocking sight, until our voices disturbed them and they decided to exit. Past our prone one-by-one bodies. Their fluttering should have been non-threatening, but in combination with the inability to get out of there, it was very unsettling. It took a lot of mental control to avoid panic, apparent lack of air, and heebie-jeebies. After the bats had passed, I caught my breath, and we entered the small opening. Upon the single stalagmite was a small note, the torn corner of a piece of a notebook. The note read in blue pen, "Nothing here."